Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Hammersmith and Fulham's informal full council meeting. I'd like to offer a special welcome to all our guests who are watching this evening or will be watching it later on YouTube. Tonight's meeting is informal, as we're no longer permitted to have official council meetings online. And given the significant increase in COVID-19 infections in our borough, for public health reasons, we agreed this meeting should be online, and therefore it's informal. My name is Councillor PJ Murphy. I'm the Mayor of the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, and I'm going to be chairing tonight's meeting. By participating in tonight's remote meeting, you're consenting to being recorded. Please be aware that if your microphone is unmuted, our viewers will be able to hear your contributions. And if your camera is on, please assume you're being broadcast to YouTube on YouTube. Just as a reminder, please, to ensure the meeting runs smoothly, please keep your microphones muted when you're not speaking. I've got a list of people who wish to speak, but if I miss you, please do raise your hand and let me know. And please keep your camera on throughout the meeting. If you have any connection issues, then please email David and he'll be able to resolve them. For our viewers at home, we suddenly lost a long-serving councillor, a much-loved man, Colin Aherne, last Sunday, and he's someone who's dedicated himself to our community over the last 35 years. As a result, this meeting is now dedicated to paying tributes to Colin, others who have passed away, and to celebrate some of our residents who have been honoured by the Queen. Public questions and special motions have been withdrawn from the agenda, and I'd like to apologise for the inconvenience, but I'd also like to really thank the officers and the councillors for their understanding and also for their forbearance. I hand over the meeting to the Chief Executive, Kim Smith, for item number 1, which is apologies for absence.
Thank you, Mayor. Apologies from absence have been received from the councillors thoroughly, quickly and severely. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to now go on to the Queen's birthday honours, and on a meeting that's going to be quite sad in parts, I think it's wonderful that we're recognising some of the outstanding people in our borough and how they've been recognised by Her Majesty the Queen. There are 3 people that have been recognised. Angela Mooney. Angela's the manager of the River Court Shore Break Service, and she was awarded an MBA for services to social care in Hammersmith and Fulham. Jacqueline Patricia Boyce was awarded the CBE for her services to community in Hammersmith and Fulham during COVID. And lastly, Caesar President, who was awarded the CBE for services to the community in Hammersmith and Fulham during COVID-19. I think on behalf of all of us here, I'd like to thank you for everything you did and for your service to our community. It's really, really appreciated. It's also with much regret that I have to inform you that we lost 5 members of staff during the pandemic. There's Richard Blandon, Suthi Shah Dukama, Ricky Collier, Vivian McKnight and Mike Slowonski. And the department have put some words together, and I'd like to read some tributes to them which bring them to life, and I hope that their families, if they're watching, just appreciate how much we thank them for the work that they did. Richard Blandon, well, he was a well-respected and valued housing benefit officer who sadly passed away after a brave battle with cancer. Richard had worked with us since the mid-90s. He was a true gentleman, funny, kind, and extremely knowledgeable. He's greatly missed by all who had the pleasure of working with him. Jusmari Shartha Kumar served as the council's principal tax officer since 2012. She lit up the office and was held in great affection by many people across the council, and one of her great achievements was to win over the hearts of the HMRC, which, if you know the tax office, that is some achievement. She was passionate about her work and made the dry topic of tax interesting and engaging. She had compassion and empathy in abundance, and she continues to be dearly missed. Ricky Collier was a social worker for many years, helping people's lives who have been devastated by drug and alcohol abuse. He inspired hope and confidence in his clients and helped many to get back on their feet and turn their lives around. He was supportive, knowledgeable, humorous, and easy to be around. His illness and passing was really unexpected, and the loss of his experience and expertise and him is keenly felt. Vivian Knight was an executive support assistant for a number of years, and she was a terrific source of support to the senior team in the economy department. She always had a warm welcome and ensured that managers were equipped for every meeting, phone call or appointment. Her smile and wit, and believe it or not, sarcasm at times, lit up each day. She was selfless, always supportive, and she's greatly missed. Last is someone that I came to know very well, and I really appreciated him. It's Mike Schlawonsky, and he joined the council just over 16 years ago. As the council risk manager and being the ruthlessly financially efficient lead, he was at the heart of driving and improving our risk management and assurance across the council and our culture around risk management. If there's ever a problem, you knew that Mike would be in the thick of it, providing support in a calm and understanding manner. He was a true gentleman. He was respectful, kind, and encouraged everyone to do the best they could. And on a personal level, I was very proud to have known him and to have worked alongside him. Two people that were stalwarts in the community have also sadly passed away. And I'd like to inform you of the death of Cedric Mortimer. He often used to accompany Mike Cartwright when he was the mayor and his lady mayoress, Rosemary Mortimer, on many of their duties, and was a wonderful support to the two of them. I had the honour of attending his funeral and then later accompanying Rosemary to the cremation. He was massively liked with Cedric and respected and greatly missed. Last we have Electra Rutter, and she's a long-standing chair of the Peabody Tenants Association. She passed away recently. She is a really hard-working resident who did a lot for her borough. She is very close to Councillor Cowan, and he would like to say a few words. Councillor Cowan.
Thank you. I would also, I think, just like to say a few words about Cedric briefly, which is, I didn't know Cedric well. I met him through Rosemary. Rosemary had known Cedric as a young woman, but met him again when she was an older woman. And their love was rekindled. And she and Cedric were married just a couple of years ago. And I was delighted. I've never seen Rosemary so happy. And as always with true love, anyone who makes a friend that happy has to be an extremely good man. Listening to the eulogies at Cedric's funeral, it was clear he wasn't just a good man, he was an adventurous, bold man with lots to offered lots to the world. I'm deeply sorry that he's gone. I know we're all very proud of Rosemary Mortimer, formerly Rosemary Pettit in Hammersmith and Fulham. She's one of the great stalwarts of the borough, and I want Rosemary particularly, and all Cedric's friends and family to know that we genuinely thank Cedric for the moment of brightness he brought into Rosemary's life, and for how those continued memories will continue to cherish her and make her happy, which is, by any measure, a very good thing to do. I am deeply sad to report about the death of Alexa Rutter. Alexa had been the chair of Peabody Hammersmith Residents Association for over 10 years, possibly 15 years. And she'd been a stalwart, and anyone who knows what it's like to be chair of a residents association, gathering everybody up, collecting all the minutes, organising speakers, getting everyone together, organising socials, making sure that people you haven't seen for a while get a knock on the door to check if they're okay. Those people are always worth their weight in gold, and Alexa was pure gold. Her mother, prior to Alexa being chair, her mother, Teresa, who was a wonderful woman, had also been chair of the Peabody Residents Association. And that is a beautiful little community in Hammersmith, just off Fulham Palace Road. Teresa had not just Alexa, but Paula and Craig as her other children. All of them are grieving, not least because it's unnatural to have your child die before you. So that grief is particularly bitter in those circumstances. But for the time Alexa was here, she lightened up the world. She had Ricky and Bobby as her own children. She's very loved and very missed. She worked at the BBC as an art graphic designer for 25 years before moving to Hammersmith, Marks and Spencer's, where she worked, and you may have seen her as you checked through or asked for her help as you got lost and struggled to find things in the store. But I think we need to celebrate these community champions more, because they really are the bricks and mortar of our civic life. They really are the people that keep everything glued together, that make days a little brighter, and that make our community stronger. Alexa was the best of us. It is devastating that she should die so suddenly at 51 years old. And I want to recognise that the whole borough of Hammersmith and Fulham mourns Alexa's death, and indeed sends our heartfelt love and sincerest condolences to Teresa and the whole Rutter family. Rest in peace, Alexa.
Thank you, Councillor. Does anybody else wish to speak? Okay, before we go on, I would just like to have just a special word for the families of the council officers. You know, what you see in front of you on the YouTube are the people that take all the glory. That's us as the councillors. But all the hard work is done by the people that we don't see, which is the officers very much. And just as a general thank you for lending us your family, your loved ones. It's helped to make Hammersmith a much better place to live. And thank you very, very much for that. I'd like now to have a minute's silence for those that have recently died. Thank you very much. It's with much regret I have to inform you of the death of Colin Aherne, former Chief Whip, who died at Hammersmith Hospital on Sunday, the 11th of July. I'll invite the leader of the council, Councillor Cowan, to say a few words.
Well, I guess it's still very raw for all of us because his passing was extremely sudden. And I know that tonight, as many people will want to speak, we're going to be joined by his family. I'm here with Melanie Campbell, who is Colin's niece. His other members of his family are tuning in to watch live on YouTube, but so are his friends, and so are people in the wider Labour family, which I know very much Colin cherished. Where do you start? I'm telling the story of Colin Aherne. And in fact, even organising tonight's meeting, the number of times I thought, I must phone Colin and ask him what we do on this particular procedure. It's just not quite sunk in. 2 weeks ago, roughly, on the Tuesday, Colin phoned me. Hello, boss, he said. I can't meet you for a drink tomorrow night. I've had a slight heart attack. His voice ever optimistic and cheery. So I phoned him back, having listened to the message. And the first thing he said was, bet you think I'll do anything to get out of buying you a beer. And to be fair, he was punctilious at buying rounds. He would never let you go if he owed you a drink. As far as he was concerned, that was part of the rules of how the universe worked, that you buy people a drink. I saw him nearly every day, really, which is the most I've seen of him because of COVID. In the last 18 months, I've been for drinks and come around my house for dinner when the law allowed. But we haven't seen enough of each other in the last 18 months. And indeed, when he came around my house a couple of months ago, I was surprised how old he was looking. But I saw him every day and went to the hospital, bar one day when I think Adam Connell went in to see him. And we chatted an awful lot. And he was generally optimistic about his chances of surviving. And indeed, when I picked him up a week ago last Friday or Thursday, and took him home, He was in very cheery mood. We went to the supermarket. We bought some food. He was making a lamb curry. He bought himself a bottle of Cobra beer to drink with his curry. And I got him back to his flat, made him a cup of tea. We chatted, and then I spoke to him the next day. Sadly, he was checked back. I said to him, sort of, you know, Colin, you've had a heart attack. They're going to fix your heart next week. They've sent you home to rest and get some sleep. So don't go out. You've had a very strenuous day. Just rest. So when I called him the next day, like, hi, Colin, how are you? I've been out, he said. I've been out. I've been for a walk around the park. I've bought myself a newspaper. He was irrepressible in many ways. And I thought, why did you go out? He goes, well, I need a newspaper. And of course, it makes perfect sense when Colin explains it. The last day I saw him, so last weekend, it became worrying. They had planned to do an operation yesterday, but he was very weak after his heart attack, so they sent him home to recuperate. And then when he had another turn, he phoned me to say he'd been checked back into hospital. So again, I rushed to see him. The last time I saw him was on Thursday night. But by Friday, he'd been checked into the ICU because he deteriorated a little bit, which when I spoke to him on Friday, he was like, you must tell Zara to organise the special motions, Steve. I know what you're like. You're very badly organised. Okay, so get Zara to do this. In fact, tell him to call me. I will tell him myself. I said, Colin, you don't need to worry. We've got this. No, get him to call me. And indeed, William Hunter, a wonderful chair of our campaign committee, who has been a Labour Party stalwart, equal fan, phoned me later saying, Colin has sent me all the forms I need. He must have worked through the night. So that was just Colin, right to the very end. He deteriorated on the Saturday, which wasn't good because he'd gone in on the Thursday. And I couldn't speak to him on the Saturday, although I spoke to the doctors 2 or 3 times a day, as did his niece Mel and his other members of his family. And then we were taking some comfort when I was talking to his family on Sunday morning, because we'd been assured that it was not an end-of-life moment. Colin was going to be operated on Thursday. He had a deterioration, but they would probably be able to, on Tuesday, we'd probably be able to do the operation on Tuesday. And Mel didn't need to rush down from Stoke-on-Trent, and I didn't need to go to the hospital. So we were very reassured by that. Roughly 20 minutes later, I had a call from the doctor saying he's asking for you. How quickly can you get here? It is extremely serious. We're preparing him for an operation. So I rushed as quick as I could to Hammersmith Hospital to go in, seeing Colin as optimistic as ever. He gave me the biggest possible smile and a thumbs up. I went over to him, and he was covered in a mask and wires, and there were about 12, one of the medics said 15 people standing around him. There were beeping noises, flashing lights, and it was chaotic. And he beckoned me closer and said, hi, said hello. And I was like, you're going to do this, Colin. It's one last operation, and we're going to come through this. And then one of the medics said, of course Colin will do this. He's one of the team that saved Charing Cross Hospital. And in which case, all then the doctors around started saying, thank you, Colin, which is some of the last words he ever heard. I had to step back as I wheeled the bed forward. And as I stepped back, he lifted his hand up for a high five and gave me a whack, nodding after I'd said to him, you're going to come through this, you're a fighter. After about an hour and a half of long waiting outside the hospital, 2 very nervous senior doctors came through and beckoned me into a quiet room to say he hadn't made it. And then they started to cry, which I guess tells you how much he meant to them. The nurse who looked after him thought me out to say, he's such a wonderful, kind gentleman. I showed her a picture, which I think is on the tribute page, Colin standing there in his suit, looking statesman-like, which was very different to the man she saw lying in the bed, covered in wires. And she was like, look at him, what a man, she said. And he really was. So that was Colin. fighting right to the very end. And it made me reflect. I'd never met anyone like Colin if it wasn't for the Labour Party. He was Labour through and through. He was Labour to his very core. And there was a reason for it, because the Labour Party was founded to fight for people like Colin and his parents. And he knew it. You know, he can tell a lot of stories over and over again, so I can probably tell you all of them, because I must have heard them so many times. But he grew up in a house in Tredegar, a rented house, of course. Dad worked in a mine. His mum worked as well at times. They had no water. They did have running water out of one tap, but no inside toilet, no electricity, no internal lighting. They lit, no internal lighting. And he'd have a bath once a week because they'd heat pans on the fire from the coal his dad had dug out the ground to heat the water. And then him and his sister and brother would get that weekly bath. And it sounds terrible. And, you know, he would say the number of times his mum and dad were worried about food, getting enough food, or just the injustices he saw on a day-to-day basis. You know, he lived that. It wasn't something to read in a book. It was Colin's life when he started out. And it made him redoubtable because he had no other option. But if you listen to him, it's a wonderful time. In fact, he wants his ashes scattered on the hill in Tredegar, where so many of his stories came from. He was very happy, and he loved he really loved his mother and father. He used to say to me, Steve, I wish you could have met my dad. I really wish you could have met my father. You'd have really liked him. So do you know what my dad, he saw things. Do you know what my dad said, he told me once, when they did the first heart operation? Obviously didn't. And he said, that's very bad news for people like us, because sooner or later, they'll start selling people's hearts, they'll start stealing people's organs, and it'll be the poor people who they get. And then when the first reports came through, he would often send me news articles he'd read, things going on in Turkey. See, my dad was right, look, it's happened. So he was lucky to have, as we all are when we have loving parents, but he had two loving parents, a mother and father who cared for him, and a loving family. And you know, that's a good thing for any of us. He was destined to go down the pits, which his dad really didn't want him to do. Lying on your belly, scraping out coal, breathing in dust. It was no life for anybody, his dad said. And so at 15, when Colin and his pal had gone to the cinema and seen a John Wayne movie, I'd love to know which one, because I wouldn't mind watching it. Colin came out and joined the army. Now he's 15. And so his dad took him somewhat nervously. He always tells a story how the recruiting sergeant tried to get him to sign up 25 years. Imagine that, trying to get someone to sign up. I can't remember the special ruling that Colin was used to get Colin in, but he joined the army shortly afterwards, whatever age he was. But just for a few years. He was quickly sent to Borneo in the Malaysia-Indonesia conflict, saw active service. He was so brave, he got commissioned. He became a sergeant. He was a gunner, which I think damaged his already bad hearing, which made him famously deaf, which contributed to being famously loud if ever you talked. But we can come on to that a little bit. Colin was an independent thinker. One of the stories he would tell was, you know, when they got back from Borneo, he was being trained for the possibility of imminent nuclear war, as was the case in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And he was being told that when the nuclear bombs hit Britain, there may well be mass hunger and the hospitals won't have any facilities. And you could have a scenario where people are breaking into property and stealing from supermarkets, and there's riots. And the army would be deployed to the streets, and in certain circles would be told to open fire on British citizens. Colin told me this story incredulously, because he put his hand up as only Colin would, and was like, well, I won't do that. I'm not firing on people desperate after a nuclear attack. And he was quite right, obviously. But he left the army shortly after that, honourably. He realised it wasn't for him. He joined CND, actually, as many people did at that time. He became an active trade unionist and was known throughout the trade union movement for his integrity. And for his word meaning something, and for his sheer hard work, and for caring about the people who paid their dues to have him represent them in sometimes horrible circumstances. He was arrested, he tells me, in King Street. I say he tells me, I mean, he told me, in King Street for collecting money for the miners, many of them people who were his school friends in Tredega, to send food parcels back to the miners during the miners' strike. And it left him with a very sceptical view of the law and justice at the time, and confirmed his views on the way the system was sometimes stacked against the little guy. He was elected into Hammersmith and Fulham in 1986. Arriving in Hammersmith and Fulham as an elected representative, as a politician, that fairness of his life was colourful enough for any of us. It's like the stuff from a book, but it was Colin's life, and it hardwired his values into his DNA. He just knew certain truths. He would say, and I apologise for the political point, but Colin's view was it is always right for Labour to be in power, and anyone in the Labour Party who doesn't think we're anything other about seeking power, he always used to say shouldn't be in the Labour Party, because it mattered to people like his parents when Labour won in 1945. And he would give short shrift to anyone who thought it was sort of a debating club, or about this, something you could join for any other reason than to win power. So he was very, very black and white in the way he viewed the world, and that was one of the ways he viewed the world. When Colin became the whip, he developed a reputation as the best barrack room lawyer anyone had ever had. That, could be seen as an insult by some, but it was a compliment, because it was a reference to his absolute meticulousness in the way he prepared. I noted Coyote said when he was writing in the condolences that when he came, he just had to up his game. He just knew Colin knew all the rules. In fact, Colin knew all the rules. And actually, so what taken was he with rules? He just, would be very, very cross, even doubtful if rules didn't get followed. I remember showing him a picture, because he loved my kids, he loved all kids. I remember showing a picture I was very proud of my daughter when she must have been 7, winning a race, a 100-meter sprint in Hurlingham Park. And I was like, look, she won, there she is crossing the winning line. And he was like, I think her foot has crossed into the other lane, so she would normally be disqualified. So I was like, but that was Colin, and even he could see the funny side of that. But it was a little bit where he was serious at that point. We became really, really close friends in the opposition years. He was an essential part of our opposition. And I didn't quite realise what a regimented life he had, because he'd said to us, he was very, very loyal to people. He was very loyal to Mary O'Hara. And he'd said to us, we should have the Labour group secretary should be Mary O'Hara, because she's my secretary, we should have it. And I was like, fine, whatever you want. So Mary came to join our team as an officer, but, and when I worked in the town hall, to my surprise, I was in a meeting, there was a sort of rap, tap, tap on my door. And Mary opened the door and went, Stephen, it's lunchtime. And I was like, okay, no, let's go for lunch. Because Colin had just gone for lunch and Mike had gone for lunch. And, and I used to think it was funny at the time, but when I think back, he would often say, we had to fight to get tea breaks and lunchtimes. We didn't have them, and my grandfather certainly didn't have them. And so I'm taking my lunchtime. And he was fairly regimented in that approach. Mike and Colin's lunches were famous. Colin, I think, as he said in one of his speeches, I think he, with some truth in this, would say, me and Mike have spent the last hour talking about a variety of things, and if only everyone else could have heard what we were saying, a lot of the world's problems, we'd have put them to right. Okay, because we've got all the answers. I sort of agree. He did have a lot of answers. He was a mentor to all of us, starting with me when I got elected in 1998, and he certainly mentored me. Certainly, he asked me. I hadn't expected or wanted to be the leader of the opposition in 2006. Colin had persuaded me to stand in 2006, along with others. But it was Colin, Lisa Nandy, and Mike Cartwright. Like, you have to be the leader. It's your duty. And that's how I ended up in that position, and ended up working very closely with him. Very quickly on, Lisa and Andy, we all appointed mentors. We decided to run a professional operation, and Lisa and Andy asked for Colin And I remember when she said to me, I'm going for my first mentoring session with Colin on Thursday night. I was like, very good. Let me know how it goes. So the next day, she called me up. Yeah, it was interesting. It was like, what happened? He's like, well, we went to Saludration, drank 5 pints of lager, and then he took me for a curry where we drank another pint. I spoke to Colin afterwards, like, when I say mentoring Colin, he's like, oh, no. He went, that girl will go far. I've told her everything she needs to know. To be fair, she has. But that was part of the joy of Colin. And he, you know, that really was. In administration, we got to administration. Colin was so proud of everything we're doing, especially with the sort of sheer cuts in the budget we had. You know, our budget is significantly smaller than it's ever been, and yet we're doing more things. And Colin would just talk about that in the way that older generation sometimes does when they're proud of their, you know, half-wit kids doing something good, which I think is how he viewed me sometimes. Although when the nurse said to me in the hospital recently, is Colin your dad? He looked askance, as he'd always thought of himself as my brother, which he was. There's lots of people who were written in, which are very touching. I was generally touched for Alex Chalk, who's a Conservative councillor I always liked, who's now the MP for Conservative MP for Cheltenham. Has written to Melanie, he contacted me and said, I'll read it out actually. He said, dear Melanie, if I may, I wanted to write to say, and this is in his handwritten note. So if I struggle to read the writing, it's because of that. I wanted to write to say how sorry I was to learn of your uncle's passing. I got to know Colin through Hammersmith and Fulham Council. He seemed he worked on the planning committee together. He was a tough opponent, in quotation marks, because we never really saw people as opponents. But he was principled and fair, and he always pushed me hard on the need for more social housing. He was right to do so. He had a great sense of humour too. As a barrister, I remember arriving at a planning meeting with my wheelie, in quotation marks, bag of papers. He took one look at that and said, what have you got in there? Money? He always made me laugh. Strong, decent, loyal. I know you will miss him. Plenty of people across the political divide will too. That's for Alex Chalk, who I always liked, and it's very kind to him to written in. But if you look online at where we posted things, Janet Aherne, when I reported the loss of Colin, wrote on a Facebook page, and I don't know Janet, I know she comments on things. Oh no, I will never forget him. How he helped my mum and dad out when they had trouble from the people who lived next door. Rest in peace, Colin. And then Denise Howard wrote, I met him once. He came to Wormholt Park School for something. He's the one I said to go to if H&F Benefits Office didn't stop messing me about. It worked. After 4 months of them putting me off, we sorted. It was all sorted within a week. That's how he worked. Good bloke. And there's lots of others. I encourage you to look at the condolence book. It's packed with people saying such things as Colin, about Colin. And Niamh O'Brady thought very much about Colin. She knew from the early days, and I'll just get that here now. He said, well, you give me a second, but I had it here. Niamh said, this very beautiful man, Colin, has died today. I loved Colin my whole life as a friend and as a comrade since I was 22. He made me join the TGW when Ron Todd was regional secretary. And then she goes on to say, we canvassed the White City, went to Electra Council and partied. And then she finishes off, we disagreed politically, we loved each other anyway. My dearest Colin, rest in peace. And I know he was particularly fond of Niamh and Jeremy, who were his friends. There are many people who want to say words about Colin, so I won't say everything. Colin often said to me, his biggest regret was not having children. And he would say it with some real sorrow. But actually, if you listen to what the Labour group and the eulogies that were given on Monday night, and people were in tears. It was an extremely emotional event. The shock of it hadn't sunk in. There were lots of people there young enough to be his children who looked at him like a father figure, grandfather, uncle. I think they considered him something more than just a fellow councillor. His time on Wormholt and White City, he an awful lot when he was a school governor. He worked on the adoptions panel. He closed down Elsby School because it was a failing school, and his view was no kid should ever be failed by school. You need to give every child the best possible chance in life. He cared about that passionately. Jane Sheehan, one of his friends, told me how when she'd had a baby, Emma, her first child, he bought her scale electrics when she was 2. I said, I'm not getting into any of his gender stereotyping. And even to this day, she's now 30. She loved that scale electrics and played as a young girl. Carlton leaves behind his nephews and nieces who he really loved: Martin, Penny, Leslie, Jenny, Bobby, and Mel, who just adored him. They would tell how he'd come to London, he'd show them around Shepherd's Bush as his kingdom. He'd take them walking up the monument of the Fire of London. Even though he was older than them and breathless, he was first up the stairs and was always encouraging them to run. He had a huge family. He loved his sister. He had a brother, Terry. He saw his sister a lot. You know, it's very hard to come to terms with the fact that Colin's gone, and I'm surprised. You know, what I would say about Colin, if ever you went, he lived such a simple life. He liked a good pub, a pint of pride, a good meal. I remember once buying him a meat pie from Borough Market. Him and Mike, I've been in Borough Market, bought him a meat pie, and said the next day, how was it? He was, oh, it's gorgeous. I had it with a Scotch egg and a block of cheese. I was like, what? You know, who has a meat pie with that? We loved kippers together. He told me he loved pork pies. He was a very unusual person, but he was an amazing, beautiful man. You don't meet people like him very often, but he was a rare human being. He was bold, he was brave. He went into that operation expecting another fight, not blinking. That's how Colin faced everything in his life. I remember those dark days of opposition. He was one of the most optimistic people around. And I always used to think to myself, isn't it ironic that a boy from the valleys should know, or maybe it's just telling that a boy from the valleys should know, but when you're in the darkest part of the valley, if you keep moving forward, you end up in the sunny uplands. And even though Colin and I are both atheists, I like to think of him now in the sunny uplands. Maybe he's up there with Mike Cartwright, eating a pie and mash with a pint of pride to wash it down, and talking about putting the world to rights. Anyway, that's my ramblings. And I loved him. I miss him. Will do. Rest in peace, Colin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Cowan. Thank you. I now call on Councillor Brocklebank Fowler to speak. Victoria?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The Conservative group were deeply shocked and saddened to learn of Colin's death earlier this week. He served his ward, Wormholt and White City, and the Labour group for over half his adult life. This is an extraordinary example of dedication to public service. He was an old school Labour gentleman through and through. Colin always looked so smart in his blazer and tie, the former adorned proudly with a red rose at annual council. He continued dressing in the same manner at our virtual meetings through this last year. The care which he took with his appearance reflected his attention to detail and his pride at representing his residents, who will miss him deeply. Colin's work on licensing and planning, two of the most time-consuming and arduous committees, illustrated his extraordinary dedication of time to our borough. He was a charismatic chief whip, and he clearly enjoyed and was honoured to have that role. His knowledge of the history of our borough, particularly Hammersmith, was profound, and his considered opinion was always worth listening to. He was friendly to us and was always up for an informal chat, even though he profoundly disagreed with our policies. It is very right and fitting that this evening's council meeting be dedicated to remembering Colin's life and public work. Vociferous debate would not have been appropriate, so that is why we immediately agreed to withdraw our special motions on hearing of his death. Colin will be remembered fondly by us all in this chamber, and our deepest sympathies and condolences are extended to his family, friends and colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed. I call on Councillor Macmillan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to say a few words about Colin. I've been privileged to be one of his co-councillors in Wormholt and White City since 2014. As many of you will have seen, the leader of the council has published a beautiful tribute to Colin on the council's website. And the standout part for me is where he details Colin's tough upbringing, as he's done this evening, and the fact he spent his 18th birthday being shot at in Borneo, and says, "This harsh life could have produced a harsh, bitter man, but Colin was quite the opposite. He was one of the kindest, sweetest, most caring and optimistic people I've ever met." And that for me is Colin in a nutshell. I first got to know him when I first got involved in the party locally just over 10 years ago. It's not often spoken about, but one of the greatest joys, I think, of being involved in the Labour Party is the fact that it gives you the opportunity to meet, mix with, and ultimately develop what can only be described as familial bonds with people from completely different backgrounds to ourselves. And for me, that was epitomised by the time I spent chatting to Colin, Mike Cartwright and William Hunter in the Salutation after Labour Party meetings in my very early days of being involved. Chatting to somebody as interested and interesting and kind as Colin in the pub is what helped to convince me that I wanted to get involved in this wonderful local Labour Party. I was therefore delighted to be selected to stand in Wormholt and White City alongside Colin for the 2014 council elections. As I'm sure Councillor Schmid will also say when he speaks, you cannot knock on doors in our ward for any length of time without meeting someone who's got a story of how Colin helped them with a problem they had. You also couldn't hope for a better ward councillor to come onto the council with. No one, as many people will say this evening, no one knew more about how things worked than Colin. And to have someone so understanding of family and childcare commitments is also something I will be forever grateful for. I think I teased him at a recent council meeting about the time he insisted that my first night out after 3 months after giving birth to my son was to come to a full council meeting. But I didn't mention the times he stood in for me at surgeries or door knocking sessions or all of the flexibility he actually did allow me over the years as Chief Whip. I was also fortunate enough to serve, and it's already been mentioned, but serve alongside Colin on the governing body of Wormholt Primary School. Colin was on that governing body for over 40 years, taking the role of chair for 30 years. I just want to give you some context to that time span. Their legendary head teacher, Julie James, retired at retirement age a few years ago. Colin had appointed her as an NQT. The current head teacher, Anika Hagi, has asked me to read a statement on behalf of the school, which I will if you'll allow me. She said, "Colin was our Wormholt Park legend. He was part of the governing body for around 40 years, over 30 as our chair. He was fiercely passionate about our school and always fought our corner. As chair of governors, he appointed 2 of the previous head teachers. I was extremely lucky to have known him for a long time, as an NQT when I started at school, then as deputy and now as head teacher. Colin had a brilliant sense of humour and was never lost for words. At governors' meetings, he would always self-announce his arrival with the sound of his clopping shoes and his incredible laugh. It was almost like a trumpet we would hear along the school corridor before we actually saw him. Then he would appear in his smart blue jacket, shirt and red tie with his very well-polished shiny shoes. When visiting the school, Colin loved to talk to the children and really listen to what they had to say. The children were always fascinated by his stories and the staff were constantly teased about how much the Welsh were better at rugby than the English. The previous head, Julie, who was Welsh, and he would have endless banter about the rugby. Colin loved attending school events. He sat through countless nativity plays and Year 6 leavers ceremonies. But most of all, he loved attending any event with food, particularly our World Food Day. He would sit and chat to all our parents and try an abundance of different dishes. The parents and children all loved him, and he loved the rich diversity of our school community. There was a time when the children were even convinced he was actually the man who dresses up as Father Christmas each year. In meetings, Colin would always make the same comment. I would offer to make him a cup of tea, which he always accepted. In fact, he wouldn't start the meeting without his cuppa. I would say sugar, and every time he replied with, "You'd think I was sweet enough already, but yes, please, 2 sugars." He truly was sweet. He was sweet, gentle, kind, and passionate about our school. He touched the hearts and transformed the lives of so many children and staff, and he had such a positive impact on our school community. He will be deeply missed. In his memory, we will make a plaque for him to go up in our school office, so he will always be remembered and remain part of our school. So I just wanted to read that statement on behalf of Wormhole Park Primary. And I just wanted to finish by saying a little bit about what I observed as being a very special relationship in his life. And that was his friendship with Councillor Cohen, who I hope you'll forgive me, but for the purposes of the speech, I'll now call Steve. It's no secret in our group that sometimes Colin could get a little het up about some issues, driven only by his passion for making the world a better place. Colin and Steve developed a strong friendship and mutual trust over many years, and he held Steve in the highest of regards. So whatever the issue, in the end, he'd always respect the decision that had been made and back it to the hilt, no matter his own personal view. Steve continually looked out for Colin, humoured his idiosyncrasies, and they were true friends. And Steve, I think I speak for everyone in the Labour group when I say that knowing you were with him at the end gives us the greatest solid we could ask for in these circumstances. Thank you. It's crossed my mind that we should regret that Colin did not reach an edge of retirement from the council, so that when he stood down, he could hear all of the wonderful things people will say about him this evening in person. But who am I kidding? Colin was never going to retire, and I suspect deep down he knew how much we all loved him. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Councillor. Thank you so much. I call on Councillor Colin. Adam?
Thanks very much, PJ, and thanks, Steve and Sue, and thank you, Victoria, as well, for your tributes to Colin earlier this evening. I'm going to start the same way I did at the Labour Group on Monday, and just say that the history books of socialism in the UK are going to have to be rewritten with Colin's death. As we remember, Aneurin Bevan, the founder of the NHS, as the greatest socialist to come out of the Welsh Valleys town of Tredegar. But this week Aneurin Bevan is being demoted to second place, and we're elevating Colin Aherne as the greatest Welsh socialist ever to have lived, and certainly the greatest ever to have come out of Tredegar. And although Colin moved out of Wales as a child, the passion Colin had for Wales stayed with him for the rest of his life, to the point where there was an informal Welsh caucus in the Labour group of Rowan and Colin and myself, where we would keep each other up to date on the latest happenings in the rugby, and it won't be the same without Colin there. And we've heard from Steve as well about how Colin lived an extraordinary life, a colourful life, from his service in the army to his time on the shop floor as a shop steward, and his time as a councillor as well. But there are things that I find out all the time, even now, about Colin that I'd no idea about before, which just paints an even more colourful picture of the man that we all loved. So just yesterday, I found out that in Colin's radical youth, as a CND activist in Hammersmith and Fulham, he jumped on a moving train at Kensington Olympia that was carrying nuclear material through the borough. And this is just one of the many examples and the times in which Colin seemed to escape death, and man was practically invincible. He dodged mortar fire in the army in Borneo, mortar landing just feet from where he was hiding. He dodged bullets, as Sue said earlier, on his 18th birthday. He fell off a ladder and ruptured his aorta, but still Colin soldiered on and carried on. And it's just a shame that his immortality, unfortunately, has recently run out. Colin has been a long-standing friend of mine, dear friend of mine, and a dear friend whose the relationship has developed over time, from early days when I moved to Hammersmith and Fulham, and through his time supporting campaigning in Addison during the 2014 election and the 2018 election. Colin would always be the first person to turn up canvassing outside the Richmond pub on Shepherd's Bush Road. He'd be sat on the step, smoking a cigarette, and if you arrived and he was still smoking, he'd put the cigarette away in his special pouch, never leaving a cigarette butt on the street, and he would take that cigarette back home with him to throw away, or perhaps even carry on smoking later, who knows. And there are many happy stories of Colin canvassing in Addison, including some stories that I'm sure Rachel and others will pick up later in the evening. But two stories from Addison that I'll just like to share from his time canvassing with us. First of all, was the Colin's trousers were always a little bit too long, and always his trousers when canvassing were slightly under the heel of his shoe, and so we lived in terrible fear that Colin would trip up when travelling up or down one of the endless basements in Addison Ward, but he never did, thank goodness, and he always managed to know where his trousers were and not trip up over them. And the second is that, and we've heard about the strength and power of Colin's voice. It is a canvassing session we had in the Chaircroft estate where Sue McMillan was leading us around, and such was the strength of Colin's voice that he could canvass 6 flats at the same time, because everyone would open their doors and say, you know, who is that man? I remember one woman in particular opening her door, having failed to answer it, and shouting at the gaggle of Labour activists, "Will someone shut that bloody man up?" Because his voice was carrying so much into his flat. But a true friend of those of us who've been campaigning in Addison over the years. But it was during lockdown that my relationship and Rachel's relationship with Colin really grew, and we were fortunate to spend even more time with Colin over lockdown. Starting off with drinks on the steps outside Colin's front door in Shepherd's Bush, where we'd bring the beer and he'd bring the crisps, or he'd bring the beer and we'd bring the crisps, and we'd spend a Saturday afternoon just sat on his doorstep, having what I thought was a quite quiet conversation, but clearly half the street could hear what Colin was talking about. And then that, of course, then turned into the pub when the pubs reopened. And I think the first pub trick I took last summer when the pubs reopened was to the Swan with Colin, where he was there with his face mask and sanitising his hands and popping out for a cigarette and making sure he sanitised in and out every time. Always with a pint of Pride if it was available, or a Guinness if it wasn't. The one pub we didn't go to, though, was the Andover Arms, where Colin to this day remains barred. He told us it was because he was canoodling a bit too much with a romantic friend of his back in the day, and they wouldn't let him back in after that. So goodness knows what he did to deserve that, being barred from the Andover Arms. But I'll certainly make sure to go there and raise a glass in his memory. I'll just conclude by just saying I had the privilege, as Steve mentioned, to go and visit Colin in Hammersmith Hospital just after he'd gone in, and spent some time with him. He was, of course, wired up to all the monitors in the coronary care unit. Didn't understand, why on earth he was in hospital, why on earth he was being monitored at all, and why he couldn't watch telly and walk around and had to be chained to his bed. But he was so full of energy and so Colin-like, you wouldn't be able to tell that he was unwell in the slightest. And such was Colin's civic mindedness when we were in there, that he gave me his keys to his flat, and he said, "Adam, I've got 2 library books. We need to make sure those library books go back to the library on time so that other people can make sure they can borrow them and read them." So off I went to Colin's flat, picked up his library books and returned them to Shepherd's Bush Library on his behalf. So it's good that they're back in circulation for anyone who's interested in modern fantasy or science fiction, as Colin was and voraciously read. And finally, then, this one's for the public health team. We know Colin was a long-standing smoker, smoked for many years, never gave up until I saw him in hospital, and he told Steve the same thing and said, "Right, that's it. When I get out of here, I'm never smoking a cigarette again. I'm giving up." He'd finally worked out it wasn't good for his health. If we can make sure that's reflected in the public health statistics as a successful intervention for someone in the borough giving up smoking, I think that would be well recorded. He was a great man. I loved him dearly. Watching Wales at rugby will never be the same again. But when I put on the Welsh shirt, I'll be cheering Wales on extra hard, knowing that Colin will be doing so as well. But thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And I think the image of Colin canoodling in a pub is one that shouldn't necessarily be in our mind, but I think it's never going to be got rid of. Dear me. Okay, let's move on to Councillor Layton. Rachel?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's only been a few short days since Colin's passing, and I think it really hasn't quite sunk in for me yet, as I'm sure it hasn't for many of you. I find it very difficult to understand that we will never see him again and never speak to him again, and I miss him a great deal already. Like many of you, I had assumed that Colin was immortal. He seemed to have cheated death so many times, I assumed he would be with us forever. When we asked him if he was standing again in 2022, he replied, "Oh yes," without hesitation. And he leaves a huge hole behind him in the Labour group, and we are all the poorer for losing him. I have always been a big fan of Colin's. Even before I joined the Labour group, I admired him and liked him a great deal. Colin was one of the loveliest, kindest and warmest people I have ever met. And I must say, despite being married to another member of the Labour group, I think Colin was definitely my favourite councillor. I liked him immediately and came to admire him more and more over the years as I got to know him better. I always found him incredibly easy to get on with and a pleasure to spend time with. When I ran in Addison in 2018, Colin was a huge support to me and the other Addison candidates. I think he only ever missed a session on one occasion when I'd sent him to A&E because he'd slashed his head open on the bus on the way there. He seemed incredibly surprised that I thought that a bleeding head wound was adequate reason to miss a canvassing session, but happily got down on the bus to Charing Cross when I insisted. Colin was a stalwart of the planning committee. He contributed only when he felt he needed to and always kept his comments brief and to the point, something which I'm hoping one or two members of the committee may wish to take on board in his memory. He had an instinct for when developers were trying to pull a fast one or cut corners, and he had a really strong sense of social justice. He cared deeply about building affordable and crucially quality housing in the borough and felt that this was something that everyone had a right to. As Adam has said, we were lucky enough to get to know Colin better over lockdown. We would share a drink and a natter with him on his stoop when restrictions allowed, or go to the pub with him when that was allowed too. I absolutely loved listening to his stories and I enjoyed the time I had with him hugely. Colin, like many people, I think, found the restrictions and lockdowns of the past 18 months very hard. He missed his routine of going into the office and chatting with officers and councillors, and he particularly missed, I think, being able to go to the pub after committee meetings. And so I'm really pleased that he and the other members of the planning committee were able to do this again recently before he died. It feels particularly cruel that Colin has been taken away from us at this moment, because I know how keen he was to return to normal life. Colin was a hugely supportive chief whip. His motto was "health comes first." He was particularly supportive of me in the last few months when my pregnancy precluded me from attending meetings in person, something that I was really grateful for. And Adam, who was able to visit Colin in hospital not long before he died, told me how hugely excited he was to meet the baby. He insisted that he wanted to be in the top 10 of people we informed first. And the last time I spoke to him on the phone when he was in hospital, he was wishing me all the best for what he had started referring to as my big day. I feel hugely sad on a personal note that our little one won't be able to have the honour and pleasure of meeting Colin when they arrive very, very soon. But we will tell them all about our great friend Colin. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Councillor Stainton. Francis?
Yes, thank you. I think we all send our special condolences to Colin Ahерne's family and his colleagues and all the young friends and old friends and middle-aged friends that he had in this world. He was a redoubtable and exceptional man and recognised for all his great qualities. He had such a presence that for over 3 decades, it really is hard for us to realise that he has passed away. And I hear it reflected this in speeches from the other people. It always seems unreal. So we can now only pay tribute to him and wish him Godspeed. He had a particularly varied and colourful personality, and I had a very interesting time with Colin because we had an extraordinary different set of situations where we were put together. Initially, was on planning apps, where we had some very feisty and lively debates about how we believed in this or didn't believe in that, and eventually argued the toss until we got to the answer. But then I think after about 10 years, he'd been the administration chief whip. And in 2002, I became the opposition whip. So I met him prior to every full council meeting to discuss procedures. He was very experienced and I was completely new. So I had a lot to learn from him and was grateful for the image and the
I'm sorry, Councillor Stainton, I'm afraid somehow so we just missed you for a while because you've been muted.
Oh, had I?
Yeah, so you're back on now. So
should I begin again, or
not right back to the beginning, but just 30 seconds ago would be.
Oh, just after the planning apps bit and how.
That's right. Yes, that's exactly it.
That's it. So then it was in he was our administration chief whip for some 10 years, and then in 2002 I became the opposition whip, and meeting him at this point for every full council meeting to discuss the procedures. He was very experienced and I was completely new. So this was an interesting position to be in, and I must say I learned a lot from him. I thought he got himself very well prepared, and I learned a great deal of the techniques that you need. But then in 2006, this is politics for you, our roles were reversed. Suddenly, he was the opposition whip and I was the administration chief whip. So this really didn't change our relationship. We still got on very well, and we met each other as usual before every council meeting. Then in 2011, my own role changed, being asked to have the honour of being mayor of the borough. So again, I knew Colin from a different aspect. This time he was, being quite naughty as an opposition and firing lots of shots at me to see if I could take them, which I found was good fun and enjoyed it a lot. And so what I think that is really extraordinary about him is that it was 35 years that he's been serving the council, and that was, I think, virtually half his life. And it was spent in the service of the borough, as we've heard from so many people right across the board, of the amazing reach he had into the society he lived in at all aspects. And I think this will be very much appreciated. He and Mike Cartwright, I think, will be long remembered and long respected and loved in the borough. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Thank you. And I move on to Councillor Harcourt. Wesley?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Like so many of the speakers before me, I really can't believe that I'd be here for what is in fact the third time within a year speaking about colleagues who had passed away. I really, I don't know what to say. I know they say bad things come in threes, but I never expected it the third to be saying words about Colin and his passing. Colin, and it's come so shortly after I'd done exactly the same for our mutual friend Mike Cartwright. Colin had always been so fit, and I'd only spoken to him a week or so ago. I remember he was telling me he was due to be released from hospital the next day, and he was talking about how fit he felt and ready to resume life as before, life to the full, that he would go out and carry on as if nothing had ever happened. Colin's death, well, it just still hasn't sunk in. I can't believe it. It's very raw in my mind. I just can't forget how cut up Colin was after we'd held a joint Skype call with Mike Cartwright just before he died. I never ever thought that Colin would be next, and certainly not so soon afterwards. How quickly things change. I'd known Colin, I suppose, for 35 years, when I moved into the borough and joined the Hammersmith Labour Party. I have to say, we certainly didn't hit it off to start with. I was a newcomer, bringing ideas and methods from another branch of the Labour Party. And it wasn't really, I suppose, as I recall, until he realised that my views on trade unions were similar to his when I refused to go to party conference to move what we considered to be an anti-trade union motion. And after that, we became friends. It's always hard, isn't it? Excuse me, 1 second while I shut my door. Oh, the joys of working from home. I was going to say, you know, it's difficult, isn't it, you know, not to be sad or emotional when a good friend moves or passes on. But I think what I want to do is really try and recall some of the good times and the funny moments that we had, like the time I was working late in the party office with former councillor Josie Wicks, when a commotion just after midnight was followed by Colin running down from his flat above in the office, shouting, "Call the police, call the fire brigade, 2 men have just broken into my bedroom, next door's on fire." Or the time at planning committee, when a Conservative councillor, who will remain nameless, came up to me after the meeting, complaining about the split in the crotch of Colin's trousers. I'll never forget going to the pub afterwards and asking him about the colour of his underwear, as I had to check out whether the complaint was accurate or not. I'll never forget his reaction. It was an absolute picture. It's been a long-standing joke in the pub ever since, not least because that same councillor once referred to Colin as a ravening wolf, something which I think quite tickled him. You know, something I'm never going to forget are those nights in the pub after planning committee with Mike and Colin, when Colin would go on about the old days, about his house in Tredegar before anybody had any electricity. He was really chuffed, I recall, when I sent him a picture of the clock tower in Tredegar, where I'd been on when I was on holiday one year, and offered him the prize of a pint if he could guess where it was. In those times in the pub, I remember, you know, other members have mentioned going and drinking 3, 4, 5 pints. There was only one occasion I ever saw Colin drunk. He always swore blind that he couldn't get hangovers. I recall it was after a group meeting and Steve and myself had joined Colin after a short while. When we got there, well, quite frankly, he'd obviously had quite a few and wasn't making a lot of sense. I think we thought it best to give him a lift home rather than stay for a drink. And one of the things he said all the way home was one thing he kept repeating time and time again was, "Can I tell you something in confidence? I think I'm a little bit drunk." I think tonight perhaps is the right time to break that confidence. I hope you won't mind. You know, after so many years, you get to know the real person, perhaps not just the chief whip persona. Colin, on one occasion, admitted that he liked Britney Spears, and that, as Steve said earlier, his one real regret in life was not having children, and that's why his family and his niece meant so much to him. You know, over the years, we've had our stand-up rows, but the mark of true friendship was that we'd get over it after a couple of pints, and things would be back to normal, as if nothing had ever happened. Colin always said to me that he intended staying on as a councillor as he wanted to outdo Manny Shinwell's record for the number of years served in Parliament. It's so sad that will now never happen. Colin used to say, "Don't go to see a doctor, they'll only tell you you're ill," and I just can't get used to him being gone. So many things remind me of him. A couple of days ago, I was watching the Lions tour of South Africa, and it just brought back memories of the rivalry and banter we'd regularly have over the Six Nations rugby, and especially the England-Wales matches. I just had to turn the rugby off. I just couldn't face watching it. There were too many memories. Luckily, in many ways, my last memory of Colin, or seeing Colin at any rate, was a happy one. And that was after the last planning committee, when Colin, myself and Councillor Harvey were able to retreat to the pub for a couple of pints. Things were almost back to normal. Colin was so happy. You know, I don't know what to say. I really dread going back to the council office now, or to planning committee where Colin served with me for so many years. Too many memories, too many happy memories, too many sad memories. I'm beginning to wonder who's going to be next. Perhaps I'd better stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Thank you, Wesley. I'd like to move on to Councillor Jones. Andrew?
Thanks, mate, very much, Mr. Mayor. I spoke to Colin, I think about a week ago, as much as many colleagues have said, and I'm bowled over by the shock of it. I can't believe he's not there anymore. I reflected before what I'm about to say about how long Colin was part of my adult life, which is most of it, over around 20 years. And I can't share it with technology here, but I think on the tributes there's a picture which you may well have seen, which is, I think, sums up for me Colin in the council chamber. It's from a few years ago, from 2018, from the AGM after we won again, and Colin is standing there with Mike in the background, gently bantering at colleagues in the opposition, but as always with Colin, in good humour and his booming voice, and I can hear him now. So, like others, I'm struggling to sort of come to terms with the fact that Colin is not there. As I said, I spoke to him a week ago. Colin always had a habit of being able to ring me up at what were basically inopportune moments, whether I'd be in the street or putting my daughter to bed or whenever, but always I would speak to Colin, and that seems to have been a regular feature of the last 20 years. Last week, of course, it's strange being in this meeting, he rang me up to say, as Wesley's referred to, I think it was about 11:30 in the morning, and the special motions were due in at midday. As colleagues in the group, I probably shouldn't share this here. This was not an unfamiliar experience in terms of our approach, sometimes with special motions, and Colin, of course, was completely in control. I think he had been desperately ringing a number of people who were involved in the motions and doing his job even a week ago as Chief Whip. So I met Colin now, as I said, about 20 years ago in the campaign for the 2002 council election. And he wasn't quite the first person I met having moved to the borough in the Hammersmith and Fulham Labour Party, but he was pretty close. And I remember distinctly that before I was a candidate in that election, and having not been in the borough very long, I, as you would, went campaigning, I think on a very cold winter's morning on the Clement Attlee estate, which many colleagues on both sides of the chamber know well. And I don't know what happened, but for whatever reason, I was new and didn't really know anybody, and the only other person there was Colin, which in many cases in campaigning sessions in the depths of winter might have led to people going home. But not Colin and I. We spent, my first meeting of Colin was to spend a very happy, in a sense, having just met him, hour and a half campaigning on the Clement Attlee estate and meeting lots of people, not, as I later learnt, in his ward, but many of whom seemed to know who he was. And I think that sums up some of the comments that have been made this evening. Colin touched the lives of so many people, thousands of people, and it was evident to me immediately that he was somebody very special. At a personal level, to share another element of this, when my sister introduced me to her now husband a few years later than that, but many years ago now, one of the first conversations I had with him was how he lived in Shepherd's Bush. And I said, oh, well, I'm involved with Hammersmith and Fulham Council. He said, oh, Colin Aherne. Yes, Colin Aherne helped me a lot. And I think he now lives in the north of England with my sister. But I think that showed you how many people Colin has helped over that huge span of time. If you're looking at the tributes, as Steve said, people we have never even known have been touched and helped by Colin. He had an absolutely fastidious approach to casework. So, as Wesley said, the things that I can't begin to list, the things that I will miss about Colin, all the things that I learned about him. But I was thinking over the weekend, one of the things that I will miss most is all of the bits of life that he taught me around his rules and regulations. So, for example, I will never quite see August in the same way ever again, because Colin, of course, as many people will know, had an absolutely meticulous approach to his council work and his representation of the residents. But he was always very clear that August was holiday time and that people took holiday, and that's what you did. And whilst Colin's phone calls frequently punctuated my life at other times of the year, I wouldn't receive a call, apart from perhaps a social one, in August, when for many years he was painting his flat. On another occasion, when he punctuated my my life, I remember distinctly being on a walking holiday in Wales, which and he rang me up to tell me that I had not done something with some sets of papers. But this did provoke a long conversation afterwards about London pride, in fact, because I tried to convince him that Welsh beer, there were many fine Welsh beers, of which I think he was sympathetic, but in running through all of these beers, and I'm sure he was sympathetic, I couldn't convince him that there was anything that was better or could ever be better than London Pride, as others have referenced. And indeed, London Pride with a pickled egg was an old favourite with fish and chips. So as Sue said, Colin leaves just a gigantic hole in Labour group, certainly in my life, and I know in colleagues' lives, and Steve's friendship for him too. And I'm struggling still to really comprehend that he's no longer with us. I think it's best summed up really by, I was talking to somebody the other day, and my instinct too is to ring up Colin to find out what I should do, and of course I now can no longer do that. Others have said what an amazing individual he was. About, I don't think anybody as a Labour councillor could surpass Colin over that span of time, the number of people he helped, the way he transmitted the values that ran through him, as Steve said, to this core. So I miss Colin enormously already. I'm only just beginning to understand that, and I will remember him for the rest of my life. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If I could call on Councillor Holder, Sharon.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Aherne, or just Colin, as most of us referred to him, was more like a grandfather, granddad to this Labour group of councillors. Quite frankly, I only started myself in 2014. That was my first term, but it really doesn't matter, or didn't matter, how long you've been a councillor or how short you've been a councillor. Councillor Aherne would always give us support, each and every one of us, through thick or thin, when we needed his advice or his guidance. We had a lot to learn, most of us. I'm still learning even now. And quite frankly, I could do with his support and his advice right this moment in time. And he will be missed. Colin Aherne was a formidable character who will not only be remembered by us, his colleagues, and also his constituents, family and friends, but also others who at some point in his 35 years of service in the Labour movement he encountered, or they encountered with him is more accurate. Like many trade unionists as I was, Colin Aherne was a lovely man who taught not just councillors, but also people who passed through his life a hell of a lot. We learnt, I certainly learnt, and I know others in the trade union movement who learn a lot from Colin's style of being so exacting, knowledgeable, and more importantly, his integrity, something he displayed no matter who you were and where you came from. I'm going to keep mine short as a councillor, or Rachel, sorry, there you go. We don't even know each other's last names because we're such friends with each other. But as Rachel asks, Colin, all I can say to you is thank you for being who you are. You will be sorely missed. God bless you, Colin, and rest in peace.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Andrew Brown. Andrew?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Apologies, 1 second. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I wanted to add a few words myself this evening. I hadn't planned on speaking, but I've been, very touched by contributions so far, particularly by the leader of the council and some of Councillor Ahерne's very close colleagues, and obviously that goes without saying that all members of the Labour group must be incredibly sad and shocked by this awful news, as well as, of course, Colin's family. My memories of Colin are varied, but also very prominent today. I remember distinctly when I was first elected in 2012. And for any members of the council who are elected in a by-election, it's a particularly unusual experience, and you are kind of the sole focus of everything that's happening within local politics for 4, 5, 6 weeks, whatever it might be, and then all of a sudden you're completely forgotten. No one tells you how to do anything. You don't know about council MP inquiries. You don't know how to do casework. You don't know the rules of the chamber. And I remember after my first meeting, and I'd seen Colin on election day on the Fulham court, and he said to me, there's a lot of votes coming out of Fulham court and Lancaster court. I'd be worried if I were you. And this was at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it had been baking sunshine all day. And then about 5:30, as everyone was coming home from work, the heavens opened and it became absolutely torrential rain. And I thought, I was worried, and Councillor Loveday, who's always the font of all pessimism when it comes to elections, was worried, and I thought, what's going to happen here? And I saw Colin at the county said, "You were all right in the end, weren't you, Andrew?" And then at the very first council meeting, he said to me, "Well done, lad," or something to that effect. And what always struck me about Colin was not just his smartness, his the way that he handled himself, but also his cross-party friendliness. I remember, I must admit, I probably bumped into Colin more than any other Labour councillor. Whenever going down to the town hall, which obviously we've not been able to do for some time for both the renovation but also COVID. Invariably I would see Colin. Whether it was walking down the corridor or quite often by the main entrance under the what was the town hall extension, and he'd always say in that big booming voice, "Hello, mate." I'm not trying to do an impression, but that was how he was always such a a forceful but friendly character. And I remember vividly a conversation with him straight after a council meeting, shortly after I'd been elected as leader of the group. And he said, there'd been some kind of, as there often is in our full council meetings, some contentious matter that there'd been disharmony and disagreement over. And I was, a bit riled up about it and said, "Look, Colin, that was completely misconstrued. That wasn't what I meant at all." And he said to me, "Look, Andrew, don't worry about it. That's the chamber. you know, and that was that. You know, I didn't know that, you know, he'd served in as a sergeant in the army. But, you know, I was going to say in my speech before Councillor Aherne mentioned that he epitomised to me what a retired sergeant in the army should be, you know, and he, you know, the fact that that's true, you know, it just shows what a, you know, a genuine and real article he was. You know, lots of people have spoken about his dedication to his constituents and to the borough, and you know, he will be sorely missed from that perspective. He'll be sorely missed, you know, in our council meetings, both online, but especially when we can hopefully meet again properly in person. And you know, he will be sorely missed, I'm sure, you know, for the Labour group. And you know, can I send my you know, heartfelt condolences to all of you, especially those closest to him, including the leader of the council, as well as Wesley, who, you know, we spent a lot of evenings along with the honourable member for Cheltenham in planning committee with you and Colin and Michael, you know, and that was, you know, some of the discussions over, you know, the quality of architecture is something that I'll never forget. And well, also, you know, I very much enjoyed that there wasn't always agreement between you yourself and you Wesley, Michael and Colin about the, you know, the architectural merits of different buildings. You know, he'll be sorely missed. Can I please also extend my condolences to his family and wider friends. And you know, I must admit, it's a shock when a member of the, you know, sitting council that, you know, I've not experienced this in my, you know, 9 years as a councillor, sadly passes away. You know, and I think it really brings home to all of us the, you know, the public service that goes into local government, and how, you know, people dedicate their lives to it. You know, he was a councillor nearly as long as I've been alive. You know, so, you know, here's to Colin, and thank you for everything you've done.
Thank you very much, Councillor Brown. Councillor Aherne. Larry?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you everyone who shared such wonderful stories of Colin so far, and will do later on. I joined the Labour Party because in my early 20s, because of reflection, I realised that growing up in White City, I had a massive tailwind behind me, and so did all my friends all the way. And Colin was one of the huge contributors to that tailwind. I first met Colin properly in about 2012 or 2013, but the reality is that he left an indelible mark on my life a good 10, 15 years earlier before that. When we first met in the salutation after a Labour Party branch meeting, as was the course, there were two funny bits to our conversation. The first one was he offered a drink and said, "I'd like a pint of Foster's, please." And anyone who knows Colin would know that was reason for him to think you might be someone to be very worried about indeed, because of his love of Pride and Guinness. And the second thing was I sort of mentioned to him that I knew who he was, and he said, "You know, I'm really sorry if I don't remember you, but I'm not sure we've met." I said, "Oh, we haven't met exactly." So he was like, "How do you know me then?" I was like, "Oh, you know, 1998, you closed my primary school down." And but obviously the Labour group are probably sick of me making that joke. We've done it plenty of times, airing of the grievances at a Christmas Labour group dinner and everything else. And but to just make a joke about that would be to undersell the pure character of the man. You see, to really understand what he did, you need to have been there at the time. And Ellerslie was just simply a completely and utterly failing school. It felt as if we had a new teacher, a new head teacher every single assembly that we had. The school was riddled with scandal. And not that I knew at the time, but talking to Colin about it, obviously he had been a hugely successful governor at Wormholt. Primary School, and he had been dropped into Ellerslie to see if he could rescue it and turn it around. And he quickly assessed that it was beyond even his powers of governance, and that it just simply was not fit for children, and he needed to do something about it. But he didn't just close the school and sort of wipe his hands of it and just go back to Wormholt. He expanded Wormholt Primary School and made sure that all of us kids went there. And I remember being welcomed on that first day, along with all of my friends from Ellerslie, by Colin and Gussie Anderson, who was a head teacher there for 20 years, and had Colin as his chair, her chair of governance, I beg your pardon, for 20 years, supporting and obviously scrutinising her as well. And it was just fantastic. And Sue mentioned Julie James, Welsh NQT that Colin hired, and he was so proud of seeing her rise through the ranks at Wormholt and loving those kids and rising to be the head teacher. I will admit that I thought myself fortunate not to be in Miss James's class, because we were slightly scared of her, but she was absolutely warm and lovely and a fantastic head teacher. And I know Caroline Plummer, the school business manager, has left a lovely message in his book of condolence as well. And you know, it's been mentioned that Colin's biggest regret was that he didn't have children. But I genuinely think it's not an exaggeration to say that in that act he performed in a way that any father would do, because he didn't close our school, he rescued us. And he took us to a school that was fantastic and loving and supported us, and it was just brilliant. And I know, having done this job now in the Cabinet for 3 years, that Colin was the best Cabinet member for children and education that this borough has never had. Because it wasn't just limited to his years of governance at Wormholt or supporting any kid that was a constituent of his or beyond. He sat for years on the adoption panel, reading through 600-page agendas and making sure that young people who had got off to a really tricky start in life had a loving home forevermore. And he was involved in setting up William Morris Sixth Form, which I also went to. And I know that they're you know, in a pub this evening, sort of signing off for the year, and those of them who have been there from the start are very sad to hear his passing as well. And I just wish there'd been a better opportunity to put it on public record with him there, how much it meant to me, on reflection of what he did. But I can tell him, if he's probably up there laughing at us all, sort of telling stories and you know, being sad. But you know, there have been so many times in the 3 years doing this job where I have simply thought, what would Colin do in this situation? And it is, I think it's held me in good stead so far, and I will absolutely continue to do so. And like everyone else, I will miss that man so dearly. And I just hope to goodness whoever's up there is serving Pride or Guinness, because they will be in for a very tough time otherwise. So Uncle Colin, we miss you dearly, and yeah, can't wait to see you soon for a catch up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Councillor Schmidt, next.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Although he clearly had an impact across Hammersmith and Fulham, as we've heard, and indeed beyond, I wanted to devote this time to explaining just how important Colin was in the area where he lived and served as a councillor for 35 years, Wormholt and White City. My first experience as a councillor was to attend my surgery in the White City Community Centre. Earlier in the day, Colin had taught me through what I needed to collect, rather what I needed to do to collect and action casework. So I sat down with some excitement and probably a little bit of self-importance when the first resident was sent in to see me. But they took one look at me, paused and said, "Oh, you're not Colin." And that hasn't changed. Even now I get, "Where is the older councillor?" and "The Welshman knows all about this problem. Can't you just ask him for the details?" And I suspect I'll get the same for years to come. For being a councillor in Wormholt and White City means following in Colin's footsteps. Whatever his many roles in the Labour Party, on the planning committee, and as a chief whip, the most important part of being a councillor to Colin was his role in his ward. As Sue has already mentioned, if you ever went canvassing with him on the White City estate or in the streets of Wormholt, you would struggle to make it 50 yards without a resident coming up to him and thanking him for helping. When you knocked on a door and Colin was canvassing the door next to you, you often were asked by the person you were trying to speak to, "Is that Colin Aherne I can hear down the hallway?" Because if he was nearby, you could definitely hear him. And everyone recognised his voice. It's no exaggeration to say that over the last 35 years, Colin directly helped thousands of residents, first in Wormholt and then in the larger Wormholt and White City ward when that was created. And by help, I don't just mean he would write down a problem and forward it to officers to deal with. Every time somebody came to him for support, he would fight and fight until he got a satisfactory answer on their behalf. Whatever else was happening in the council, the party, or the country, Colin understood that the most important fundamental role of a councillor is to support residents in need. And he was an inspiration to all of us in how tenacious he was at doing just that. Over the past few days, I've been speaking to residents in the area who knew Colin to break the sad news to them, and they have all responded with both shock and gratitude. Shock because, despite him progressing in years, I think we all just assumed he was invincible. Gratitude because of everything he had done for them and for the area. One message posted by the Wormholt Residents Association sums up what residents have been saying to me. They said, "Our community is devastated to learn that our leader, Councillor Colin Aherne, passed away. His commitment and dedication for our community will never be forgotten." I know some of Colin's family are watching, and thank you to Steve for inviting them. And I hope they know the sheer scale of his impact in his local area and those he shared it with. It was profound, and it will live on in the countless families who he helped and supported through their times of crisis. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to all those, particularly in the opposition, who paid a tribute to a great man tonight.
I echo that. Thank you. Thank you very much. If I can call Councillor Aherne, Lisa.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's really difficult to know what to say with so many other people sort of saying lots of fantastic words about Colin, many of which I would echo. I've known Colin, I think, about 30 years, and the first time that I met him would have been when I was a candidate many years ago in a by-election in Town Ward, proving that he did actually come down to Fulham once in a while. Councillor Brown's referred to an election in town, so we do know that he would come down to Fulham. And at the time I first met him, I knew he was the whip, and I always thought that was quite scary. But actually, nothing could be further from the truth. I've kind of thought about what stories and what memorable moments that I would like to share with you tonight, and there's a lot already been said, but there's just one or two things to share. Not everyone who's at the meeting or watching online will know that I have the very prestigious position on the Labour group of being the group auditor. I've done that for a number of years now, and annually I have to check the Labour group accounts, and I have to check Colin's work. A couple of years ago, he was out by about 75p on the whole year's annual accounts, and I heard from officers that he was absolutely distraught and obsessed and was not happy, would not rest till he had found that 75p. And they were all quite amused about this, because it just kind of showed how he had to be absolutely meticulous about everything. Every detail had to be 100% right, and he was never satisfied unless that was the case. Not that I was ever going to be scary to him about 75p. Another funny thing was that he didn't do WhatsApp until very recently, and it was a complete revelation when he'd mastered it. However, he was pretty good at text messages, and I've had many text exchanges with him over the years. And I had a quick look back through to see what we kind of chatted about. And I found this really bizarre exchange about there being no loo roll in the ladies' toilets on the second floor of the town hall during a council meeting. And this is when there was a massive public attendance at that council meeting. And it was just quite tardy that the council had not made sure that the toilets were up to satisfaction for having so many visitors from the public. And this text exchange was Colin and I trying to get something fixed. Nothing was ever too trivial. It didn't have to be just about getting the council right and about getting the Labour group right. Everything had to be right. We had to do our best, and he never really wanted to let anybody down. People have already mentioned how he was more widely loved and well beyond the Labour family. Residents in his ward reflected this, but I just wanted to read an email that I received yesterday on behalf of a residents group. And this is a residents group that are not Wormholt and White City residents. They're tenants and residents more widely across the borough. The email says, "Dear Lisa, we had a meeting last night and we talked about the terribly sad loss of Colin. The group asked me to email you to pass on their condolences to his friends and families. Some had very personal recollections of his warmth and humanity in working with residents, and we talked about how much he will be missed. On a personal note, this must be so devastating for you all in the Labour group. I'm thinking of you. Colin was such a lovely, lovely man, and I can't believe that he has gone." That's just for other residents that were not directly connected with Colin. Just goes to show how widely he was loved in the borough. For me personally, I'll always remember that he was a good listener, he was fair, he was accessible, he was always on top of detail. He never ever called me Lisa, I was always Lisa. And I never worked out why that was, but I guess it was a little bit of that Welsh quirkiness, and I really didn't mind. I spoke to him less than 2 weeks ago when he was first in hospital, and he was in good spirits. And I'm so pleased that I did. And never would I have imagined that that would be the last time I'd ever have the honour of talking to him. Like many tonight, I can't imagine life without Colin. Just not getting a briefing note from him for this evening's council meeting was so strange. It will be strange. It's an end of an era. Colin will be truly missed by so many, including me. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say farewell to him this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. If I could move on to Councillor Aherne. Mercy.
Thank you, Mayor. And I extend my deepest sympathy to Colin's family, his nieces and nephews. And please do forgive me if I am everywhere. So, to me, a hero is somebody who is selfless, who is generous in spirit, who just tries to give back as much as possible in helping others. To me, that's what Colin was. As a new councillor and first time councillor, I remember coming into council chamber on a Sunday for our Labour group meeting, having arrived 10 minutes late due to train delay. I became very nervous, not knowing what to do and forgetting what I got myself into. But then I met Colin, who was waiting at the corridor. And as soon as he saw me, his words put me completely at ease. He said, "We are glad to see you here, and we will give you 5 minutes to relax and get yourself together." Colin rushed into the chamber and told the group, please allow her 5 minutes to settle down. This care and support of me, a new councillor, and then is now the clearest proof of how supportive and caring a person Colin was, looking after everybody's need. On another occasion, I called in saying to Colin, I will not be able to attend to tonight's meeting due to family commitments. Colin was always said to me, do not worry, as he knew how important family is, as it was so deeply important to him, as most of us have said tonight. You know, Colin to me was a great teacher. When I was made a chair of the group, he sat by my side, told me what to do, how to do it again, making me feel at ease. He knew every rules and regulations of the council. One thing I remember most was occasion in 2004 when in a pub in Hammersmith, we are celebrating a London mayor election result, which was in June, near towards his birthday. And suddenly an announcement came that we are not only celebrating mayor's winning, we are going to celebrate Colin's birthday as well, as it was his 60th birthday. To my amusement, and they said he's going to sing for us. To my amusement, he entertained the audience so much with singing that everyone kept laughing. Colin always knew how to enjoy himself and how to celebrate important moments. My last communication with Colin was last Wednesday when I texted to him saying that my family and I wish him a speedy recovery, to which he replied, "Thank you." Colin has left a big hole in everyone's heart. I cannot believe I will not see Colin again. It was a privilege and a pleasure to know somebody so funny, so caring, so supportive as Colin. He will always be our hero in Labour Group and for most of us who knew him. To Colin, I would like to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being Colin. Thank you all.
And thank you, Mercy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Vincent, Guy?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Firstly, can I add my condolences to those of the Mayor, to the families of our colleagues who did not survive this year, and also obviously to Colin's family. I note, looking at the screen in front of me, that a lot of my colleagues have understandably put black ties on. But I wonder whether Colin would actually have preferred a red tie, as the Mayor is wearing, which would represent not just the Labour Party, but also Wales. I first met Colin in the early 80s when I started going to Labour Party meetings at the then party HQ, Dennis Pritt House at 446 Uxbridge Road. Colin was an active member of the Labour Party through his strong roots in the Transport and General Workers Union. He was also employed by the party at that time, to look after the building from his flat that was above the shop at 446. Those were the days of long, often fractious, meetings, but Colin was happy at these meetings because he could smoke at the meeting. It may seem odd now, but 40 years ago, smoking was allowed, and many, many people took advantage of it. So as Colin and others lit up, you could scarcely see across the room. And even then, in those meetings, Colin's favourite words were, "Point of order, Chair." And the point of order that concerned Colin most in those meetings was to enforce the rules that could prevent the meeting running beyond 10:50, because that was last orders at the Uxbridge Arms. Although actually, thinking about it, I suppose Colin's favourite words were not really "point of order, Chair." More likely they were "a pint of pride, please." We all know that Colin was a proud Welshman, and as a Welshman, he loved singing. And I had the pleasure of hearing Colin singing at full throttle. Some of you may remember many years ago that John Major sued the New Statesman magazine in respect of some allegations involving a caterer at number 10. This was 30 years ago, and I organised a fundraising dinner to help pay expensive lawyers to defend the New Statesman. The dinner was held at a notorious restaurant in King Street, now long gone, known as Tony's. Colin and others attended. Tony was not one to close his doors if he had thirsty customers. And the price of flaming Zambucas went up to reflect the hour of the night. So, finally, there remained a hard core of supporters, including Colin, and the guest of honour, the MP for Brent, Ken Livingstone. And Colin decided to give us a song. In fact, he decided to give us quite a lot of songs. And he insisted that everybody joined in, regardless of whether or not we knew the words, or indeed could match his voice. Colin could sing, and he knew the words to many, many socialist songs. But I think his favourite was the Irish rebel song, Kevin Barry, which he regaled us with that evening. So, my abiding, lovely memory of Colin is of him joyfully singing his heart out, arm in arm with Ken and arm in arm with his friends. Colin was the heart and soul of Hammersmith Labour. He served proudly not just this administration, but others headed by Ian Coleman, Andrew Slaughter and Stephen Burke. And I have, like many of us, been receiving messages, talking to colleagues, former friends, people who served with him. And I've been asked, firstly by former Councillor Hugh Davis, another proud Welshman, to add his respects tonight. And I've also been sent by former Councillor Dame Sally Powell, who of course served in Wormholt with Colin, some words which she asked me to read. These are: Colin, Ian, Andy, Sally, Ian, Jeremy and Naive knew Colin affectionately as the Welsh windbag, and all met in the miners' support group in 1983. We have been mates and comrades through thick and thin ever since. We all had miners sleeping on our floors for over 6 months, and apart from the 2 solicitors, were all prosecuted for collecting money for the miners. John Fitzpatrick from the Hammersmith and Fulham Law Centre defended us in the West London Magistrates Court. The case lasted 7 hours, and all the defendants fell asleep in the dock. The G&G was a fundamental part of Colin's life, and we spent many hours at London Broad Left meetings, which Colin insisted that we attend. We all shared flats at Labour Party conference every year. We'll never forget that the corner shop that did not sell butter, but had 12 types of margarine. When Colin inquired where the butter might be, the reply was, "Butter, butter? No call for that here, sir." Colin was hysterical with laughter, and he dined out on that story for years. Hammersmith and Fulham were renowned for singing songs at 3 o'clock in the morning in the Conference Hotel. The Windbag won the crown with his Welsh baritone voice, performing Kevin Barry and The Man That Waters the Workers' Beer. I always loved Colin, and I know that he did me too. I miss Colin and cry when I think of all the shared memories which we will all treasure forever. Those are the words from Sally Powell. So finally, Colin was kind, he was gentle, and he always had a smile on his face. Hammersmith will not be the same without Colin Aherne. So perhaps one day we'll all go to the salutation, raise a pint of pride, and sing a song in Colin's memory. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much. I call on Councillor Vaughan, Rory Vaughan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I would certainly echo everything that people have said tonight in terms of sending their condolences, particularly to Colin's family and other friends. It's a very sad and sudden shock that obviously most of us are still processing. I think, though, just in terms of speaking about, first of all, Colin's public life, we've lost the council's obviously longest serving councillor for 35 years. That is, by any stretch of the imagination, quite some record. I was thinking about it last night. He's been elected for nine separate terms and would have been going for a 10th next year, as we've heard. So it really is the end of an era of the last surviving councillor who was elected in the 1980s and has survived all that time. And of course, Colin hasn't just survived all that time. He's actually been a leading member of the council in for most of that era, either as its chief whip or opposition whip, which carries with it a lot of responsibility for keeping the Labour group in order, but obviously for interacting with people I've said tonight with individual members and keeping their spirits up, offering them wonderful encouragement in the work that they're doing. And obviously all of us as elected councillors have much to do serving the residents of this borough, and something that Colin has carried on with aplomb for 35 years. Clearly, the sadness I think tonight that I feel, and I'm sure many others feel, if not all of us, is that we didn't get to say goodbye, and that obviously happens when people pass away suddenly. But of course, reflecting on that, actually, what I also feel is having had the privilege of knowing Colin, in my case, for over 20 years, it truly was, as for a number of the reasons that people have mentioned tonight, a privilege to have known him. He obviously had many friends. I always think fondly of Colin, Mike, and Wesley, the sort of three amigos on the planning committee who served loyally on that for many years. Although I didn't get to spend the evenings in the pub with them after that, discussing, as people have mentioned, stuff about the architecture of various buildings, that was something that was common to all of them, and three friends who have long service to this council, and in that case to the planning committee. And I think actually the reason that Wesley has wanted to stay on that was actually for the friendship and the interest that went with serving alongside Colin and Mike. So in many ways, Colin has been the glue from certainly the Labour group and also from wider that sort of held a lot of the council together in terms of some of its processes and some of its people over 35 years. So I think it's a great loss from that respect to us all as councillors, and also to council officers who I know have relied on his advice throughout the years as well. But aside from being that figure, Colin, as people have said, is a sort of, and I think this reflects a number of sides of his council, is a sort of was a loyal Labour man, so could be partisan in his way. And I remember when I was elected in 2006, and for a few years after that, Colin, and I think with Mike Cartwright, organised a sort of an informal boycott of going to the Mayor's Parlour after the council AGM, which I didn't quite understand. That I think the shock of the change and the Conservative administration was a matter of great principle for him. So he did this for 2 or 3 years. But I remember he then got collared on his way out. I think his idea was to go to the salutation. Now, this may have been because he actually wanted to drink, as people have said, a pint of pride rather than the red wine on offer at that particular reception. But on one occasion, after a couple of years, he was actually cornered by the then leader of the council, Stephen Greenhalgh, and they had a friendly chat, and he was ushered into the Mayor's Parlour, having said that he would carry out this particular boycott. So I was delighted to take a picture of him with a glass of red wine in his hand, having sort of broken this point of principle that he'd held out so fastidiously, and we made a copy of that and put it around the Labour group office, which we delighted in teasing him for some months afterwards. But I think whilst that was amusing, and I was entertained to have caught Colin out on a point of principle on this particular occasion, I think it did show the fact that he was extremely personable, and actually his love for the council extended to all of the councillors, and he was extremely personable, as members of the opposition have discussed today, in reaching out to them as well, and personable and wanting to share his enthusiasm and friendship in that case with them. So certainly that's one of many stories that will live with me. I've had sort of the pleasure of living quite close to Colin in the past few years, and often would bump into him near White City on a Thursday evening and see he was going to a surgery or to a meeting of the White City Residents Association, and delighted in discussing some of the latest news with him. So it's with the great sadness that I think all of us feel that in a very sudden way we've lost a great friend and support, certainly to those of us in the Labour group. Also, I think more broadly within the council, and obviously, as people have spoken about tonight, within obviously the wider community of the residents he served as a councillor, the children and others that he served as a school governor. and we have lost that that friend. I loved him very much. When it suddenly sinks in that I won't see him again, I will miss him all the more. But can only thank him for the privilege of being able to serve alongside him and to call him a friend for all these years. So whilst it's an end of the era, and I'd like to say rest in peace, Colin, I'd also like to say thank you for all the great memories and all of the great support. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. That's very touching. Thank you very much. I can go to Councillor Alford. Adroni?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It was with sadness that I learned of the death of Colin Aherne. I had known Colin ever since I was elected to the council in 1990. He was a stalwart of the Labour Party and a very committed councillor. He was proud of being a councillor and all that it entailed, and he served his wards excellently and with high renown. I personally have a great many memories of him over the years, ranging from the early days of the meetings of the Housing Benefit Review Board, when together with the late Councillor Josie Wicks, the three of us would rail against the incompetence of the then housing officers. For the most part, Colin was always on the side of the applicant, and sometimes because of his passion, there would have to be a time-out called while he calmed down, for he said something totally unforgettable to the council officers. However, if he ever had any doubts about the probity of the applicants, it was quite another matter. Subsequently, he and I would sit on the personal appeals panel, and again he was clear in his judgment and decisions, and I think I can say we never disagreed. He was firm in upholding the reputation of the council. When in the council chamber, it was another matter, and I well remember a wonderful council meeting when he decided he was going to have fun, and I was the object of his comments, in which he referred to me as a latter-day Madame Defarge, always knitting. Unfortunately for him, there was a loud and vocal response from all sides saying, "Colin, she doesn't knit, she embroiders." It was one of the most witty speeches I've heard in the council chamber, and one I will never forget. To thank him for his kind allusions, I embroidered him a small picture of a red rose, which I believe he kept for some time. When I was mayor and he the opposition whips, he did disagree with my rulings on occasions, with such charm and politeness that everything passed smoothly. The Labour Party have lost in his passing someone with wisdom and acumen. He's not replaceable. It has been a privilege to be on the council with him, and I send my deepest condolences to his friends and family. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. If I call on another of the Welsh contingent, Councillor Ree.
Diolch yn fawr, Mr. Mayor.
Da gwybod beth sy'n beth.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank all the other contributors who've given tributes to Councillor Aherne this evening. I think it's been a really wonderful evening hearing stories about him, and I hope that many of his friends, his family, and some of the many residents that he's helped over the years will be watching and will be able to see that, that we cared about him just as much as they did. Whenever I think of Colin, it will be of him welcoming me with that great ear-to-ear smile of his, whether that's welcoming me into the Labour group office, where before I had a chance to sit down, he'd be quizzing me about our shared passion for the Welsh rugby team, or whether it's walking into the Garden of the Salutation to see him sitting at a table, cigarette in one hand, pint of London Pride in the other, calling me over to join him. I don't know how he did it at over 70 years of age, but after meetings at the town hall, he always seemed to manage to be the first person across the road and into the pub. I'll have to go through the papers for his 35 years on the planning committee, just to see if he had a secret tunnel installed between the two buildings at some point. In Wales, we sing, "We'll keep a welcome in the hillside," and Colin certainly took that to heart. That's how I'll remember Colin. His kindness, his smile, and always a warm welcome. Which is funny because the first time I met him, I was absolutely bloody terrified. It must have been nearly 10 years ago now, I was a new member of the Labour Party, very wet behind the ears. I came into a meeting and there he was, passionately holding forth on a topic he undoubtedly knew more about than most of the people in the room. Standing, arguing with his straight back, his bellowing voice, and his laser-like focused argument. It was no surprise to me when I found out that he had a military background. As Wellington apparently said, "I don't know what he does to the enemy, but by God, he frightens the life out of me." Fiercely arguing his case, banging on the tables, he was a formidable advocate for his cause and someone you always wanted on your side. Obviously, when I had the chance to meet him in person, my fears were instantly allayed by what a kind and gentle man he was, whose heart was always in the right place. So his passion was particularly on display when he was talking about something that had been raised by one of his residents or a social injustice that he'd observed in his ward. He was a tireless advocate for the people he represented. He used that same passion when fighting to get the best outcomes for them. When we talked about council work, the fire was clearly visible in him. After 35 years on the council, he was certainly an experienced head and a priceless resource for a young councillor looking to get things done. But time had not dimmed his determination to do the best for his residents. When I was first elected, I was lucky enough to join him on the planning committee and to sit next to him during meetings. I'm sure I learnt more in those hours by his side, and of others had mentioned later after the meetings and the salutation, than I would have learnt in years of trying to figure things out by myself. We didn't just talk about the council though. As I mentioned, as Councillor Connell mentioned earlier on, we shared a love for the Welsh rugby team, although sadly we never watched a game together. Although he never missed a match, Colin refused to watch games in company or outside his flat because he was always too engrossed in the game and too nervous about the result. Still, he was a more nimble texter than me, and I'd get his thoughts on the game, his praise for a try, or his anger about an incorrect refereeing decision pinged to my phone while I was still staring at the TV screen. Lots of things won't be the same without Colin, and we'll all remember him in our own ways. For me, I'll always think of him when I'm watching Wales play rugby. I'll always see him when I walk into the salutation, and I'll always hear him standing up for those who need him here in our council meetings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rowan. Thank you very much. I call on Councillor Cassidy. Ian?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And I think thank you to everyone else who's spoken before me. There have been some quite interesting stories about Colin that I wasn't aware of. I am very sad to have missed his singing. That sounds like something that I would have thoroughly enjoyed. Councillor Harcourt is shaking his head, but I disagree firmly. I'm going to start by telling tales out of school slightly. Obviously, Councillor Colin, Larry Colin, is, as we know, one of the most thoroughly organised people. But earlier today, he sent me a message saying that during Monday's Labour group meeting, he'd made a note of the speaker list for this evening, but it hadn't saved properly and he'd lost it. And I replied saying, we've only been without Colin for a few days, and yet we seem unable to organise ourselves for a Labour group meeting. And I think for me and for, I think maybe everybody in the Labour group, this is when I think I will miss Colin the most, in those little moments where he would be keeping us on the right track, making sure we're behaving ourselves, supporting us, answering our questions, keeping us organised. He'd make sure we had our red roses in our lapels when we were getting ready for the full council AGM. He'd complain when we weren't dressed smartly enough. He'd complain that we hadn't been wearing shirts and ties for full council meetings virtually. And he was a constant presence. He was always there. And I think for us as Labour councillors, the answer to so many questions was always just ask Colin. When does the meeting start? Ask Colin. Who's speaking on that motion? Ask Colin. Who's on that committee again? Ask Colin. He worked so hard to support us as Labour councillors, but he also worked so hard to support his constituents. He was not only a constant presence in our lives as Labour councillors, he was a constant presence in his ward. On more occasions than I think I'd care to remember, whatever general election would be taking place, there'd be a canvass team rushing around in the weeks preceding a general election, inevitably would be rushing up to Wormholt and White City, would be in Andy Slaughter's car or Wesley Harcourt's car, clipboards in the back, leaflets in the back, driving up Bloemfontein Road, and Colin would always come into view in the distance, already waiting for us, finishing a cigarette, ready to go out, canvassing in all weathers, speak with his constituents. And he was very kind. He was very supportive, but I think he also had very high expectations of us as councillors. He worked hard, he supported his residents, and he just expected that everybody else would do the same. He also wasn't afraid to let people know this when they maybe didn't quite live up to his expectations. After the 2015 general election, I was lucky enough to be copied into an email that Colin sent to a member who shall remain nameless. This member had been complaining that the Labour councillors had not been campaigning hard enough. We'd not been in the doorstep enough. He'd seen Labour campaigners hiding from the rain under a railway bridge instead of handing out leaflets. And he was shocked at how terribly the Labour campaign had been run. And Colin sent what was possibly the most Colin response ever. I'll quote a few of it. I never saw you in the campaign trail, and if you'd bothered to participate, you would have discovered that on the doorstep there's a huge recognition for this Labour council and for Andy Slaughter, because all the help that the councillors and the MPs have given to residents over the years. He then gave a very terse explanation of the formal process for making the complaint that this member wanted to make, and signed off. Finally, I suggest instead of just whinging, why don't you start participating in the work of your party and the work of your community locally? Yours fraternally, Colin, which I think was possibly the most Colin Aherne sign-off of an email that I can remember seeing. I will miss his advice, his support. When I became chair of the audit committee as a new councillor, I must have bombarded him with endless questions, endless queries, and they were always answered quickly. They were always answered kindly. Wesley and many others spoke earlier about having a drink after the planning committee. The evenings I spent with Adam, with Wesley and with Colin in the salutation, discussing whatever had happened in that night's meeting, are some of the fondest memories that I have as a councillor. As life begins to get back to normal after COVID, we'll begin meeting again in person, and I'm finding it very difficult to accept that Colin will not be there, that he will not be there having that drink after the salutation, buying his round, standing his round, and making jokes when you're buying some kind of slightly dubious lager or overseas beer that isn't Pride or Guinness. We will all miss him terribly, and I think it will be in those little moments where his support would be ever available that we will miss him the most. Our thoughts are with his family, and Colin will be terribly missed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Kwan. Bora.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. After having heard all the speeches this evening, anyone listening will not be surprised to hear that I first met Colin in a pub garden. The salutation. We were never actually formally introduced. I've been racking my brains to think about how it was that we actually first. I don't think we were formally introduced. I don't think Colin didn't really go for things like that. I think I just sidled up to him one evening in my sort of early years as a Labour Party member locally to ask him about something, and it sort of kicked off from there. That's what Colin was like with me anyway, no formalities, very, very casual, very, very open, always sort of willing to just listen to someone who was sort of curious about Hammersmith and Fulham, local politics. And like Councillor Aherne mentioned earlier, I've learned more sitting in pub gardens with Colin than I think I would have done from any textbook or reading any report. He was that font of knowledge. And with that in mind, I'm very proud to be able to say that I was one of the people that he reached out to for help sometimes. I don't know quite how this happened, but somewhere along the way, Colin decided that I was an expert in technology. And for the past couple of years, I've had fairly regular calls with Colin once or twice a month, usually before some meeting coming up, where he would call me to ask me about some technology related issue. I don't know where he got this idea, and I lived in constant fear of disappointing him and not being able to answer one of these questions. But thankfully for me, there were all things I could help him with. So if you ever received a sort of a correct file format or an attachment that wasn't too big, or an Excel spreadsheet where you could actually view some of the large numbers, I'm really proud to say that, you know, I did my bit. And for someone like Colin, who has many, many more decades of experience in all things, the fact that he was so easily able to just sort of, you know, reach out, grab the phone, give me a call, send me a text message. He never wielded any of his knowledge or experience with any sense of superiority or seniority. We always just met as equals. I mean, he was my chief whip. He's someone that I could have been a bit intimidated by, and I'm sure when I first met him I probably was, but I think that rapidly dropped away. As everyone said, he's so kind. He was so kind, and he just didn't have any airs and graces about him. And like Councillor Brockbank-Fowler mentioned earlier, he was always sort of impeccably dressed and turned out. And I think one of the few times, that very few, I could probably count them on hand, where I hadn't seen him in his jacket and tie was during the first lockdown last year, when I'd been speaking on the phone about some technology related issue, and he mentioned that he was slightly bored because I was asking what he was doing. He said he was slightly bored because the libraries were all shut. Like Councillor Connor earlier said, he was a voracious reader, and he'd sort of run dry of books. So thankfully I was able to help him out on that stage. I'd been coordinating sort of a sort of book drop in my area, and I was in contact with someone who was a book reviewer and had far too many books. So I was able to walk over to his flat with 3 carrier bags. I can't even remember how I carried them all, but 3 carrier bags full of crime novels for him to read, and we sat socially distanced on his front steps, you know, him in slightly more casual gear, just having a chat about, you know, how awful the pandemic was and so on. And although it was a short sort of interaction, it's one of the few times I think I'd sort of met and spoken to him outside of the town hall. So it's an experience I will really treasure. And before this meeting, I looked up the online book of condolences, and I was really amused to read an account from one of the council officers who helped Colin with setting up his iPad and smartphone a few years ago. And to quote what she said that she had created the perfect tech monster. And I think anyone who was on the receiving end of a text message of something they hadn't done from Colin might agree with that. I will miss him dearly, and I hope wherever he is now that the pub gardens are large and plentiful, the London Pride is on tap, and the libraries never close.
Thank you, Bora. Thank you. And I call on Lucy Richardson, Councillor Richardson. Lucy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As a new member, I first met Colin at the GC, and I heard him talking loudly, a fierce proponent of social justice, London Pride drinking, cigarette smoking, Thatcher hating. He was an imposing figure, fierce, passionate, uncompromising. And I was a bit scared of him. But later, when I couldn't make a meeting because of a problem with my family, he was kind and reassuring. Don't worry. Family comes first. Family always comes first. And I felt so much better. There are many others who knew him much better than me, but still I shall miss him. His physical presence and stature. He was always there for us all, listening, giving advice at his desk in the Labour office or outside the town hall having a cigarette break. But more than that, I will miss what he represented, the values he embodied. Our values, Labour values. To me, he was someone who said what he thought, who did what he said, but most importantly, he took the time to listen and think about others. As we've heard tonight, even when it wasn't to his advantage, he made people feel better. You learn a lot from knowing a man like Colin Aherne, a lot about living what you believe, being kind, honest, and generous with your time. So next time, when I'm too busy or not listening properly or paying attention, I will stop and think of him and be better. Be better for having known him. Thank you, Colin.
And thank you, Lucy. Thank you very much. And I call for Councillor Carmel. Alex?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And can I first start expressing my sympathies to Colin's family, and in particular to the wider Labour Party family. Listening to some of the tributes tonight, it has become quite apparent what a rock he had been in the local Labour Party. When you consider the changes in the Labour group from '86 to the present day, he was the one constant that was there, the steadying hand. And I had written a speech, but so much has been said already. You'll forgive me if I just try and say a few impromptu comments. But my initial thought is that Colin is up there looking down with a slightly embarrassed look, but again a little angry that no one has moved Standing Order 15E5 to allow the extension of speeches, because he wouldn't allow that to have gone on if he was still there without going through the proper standing orders. In the council chamber, as a member of the opposition, or indeed as the administration as we were for a short while, he was a very gruff and businesslike person. Sometimes we even found him somewhat intimidating. But I knew Colin better than that. As many members will know, I served on planning with him and indeed on licensing with him for many, many years. And I got to see the side of him that wasn't the gruff, authoritarian, businesslike Colin in the chamber. And indeed, I'm very pleased that at the last planning meeting we all attended in person just last month, that on the final item on the agenda, I proposed an amendment to the conditions, and rather than it being on party lines, Colin quite happily seconded my amendment. So one of my last sort of exchange I have with Colin is him supporting a Tory amendment to a planning condition. And he was like that because he wanted what was right. He invented the term, for those who've been on the planning committee with him, hobbit holes, to describe basement dwellings that are built with not enough adequate light and space. And this is a phrase that I have continued to use in the decade since it first came up. And I will continue to use it, not just in his memory, because it was a damn good description of what some developers tried to get away with. We both started as novices on the licensing committee as we fumbled our way through the Licensing Act 2003 and what this meant for this. And we learnt off each other, and we had, in the little decision room at the back of the hearing, we used to have quite frank discussions. But I think in all the years, we only ever disagreed on one license application, and that's a tribute to, as many people have said, the amount of listening that he was prepared to do. And we would talk things out and come up with what was right and proper, both for the licensee and for the local residents, and indeed for the borough. One amusing story, or I find amusing anyway, comes from the Boris versus Ken mayoral election in 2008. And I met Colin outside, as I frequently did, but not necessarily Olympia, as we were both out for a fag break, and where we had a lot of our little informal chats over the years. And he was proclaiming how Ken was going to win the election and be mayor. And I said, rubbish, it's going to be Boris. And he said, I'll bet you a pint on that in the Sally when it's over. And I said, deal. About an hour later, I sidled up to him in the count hall and said, by the way, I'm not going to hold you to that bet, because I did already know that Ken had conceded by that time. And so I think it would be unfair for me to hold you to the bet. But he was a man of honour. And after the next planning meeting, he raced out, as we've heard before, got to the Sally before me, even forgone his after planning fag before, because we always used to have a fag on the way over there, but he raced over. By the time I walked in, he had my pint waiting for me on the counter, and he said, I made a bet. It was a bad bet, but I honour my bets. And that is one memory that I will always share. And if I can just go back to a comment that Councillor Macmillan made about retirement, I believe you are absolutely correct. As he looks down on us from above with his cigarette and pint, I'm sure he is smiling as he knows he died in harness, and that is what he would have liked. Thank you very much, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. That was really lovely. Thank you very much indeed. And I now move to Councillor Brown, and this time it's Darryl Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, everyone. First and foremost, I would like to pass my condolences to Colin's family and friends. I don't believe in the English language there's an adjective to be able to describe how I'm feeling. I'm so sad that he has departed so quickly. I have known Colin for about 30 years. I met him when I was canvassing, or when he was canvassing in Sands End. And it was a short while after that, my husband and I joined the Labour Party. And here I am still. So I thank Colin really for introducing me to the party. Every time I met Colin, and I never knew him in the capacity that you all knew him. You seemed to socialise. I didn't. So I don't have those nice stories as you do. But all I can say is that I found Colin to be a very warm man. When I would speak to him, he always spoke about his family, and he always smiled. He had a lovely, deep smile. He seemed to be a very deep person. I used to describe him as though his look was an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. There was something more there. I'd love to have got to know more, but unfortunately I didn't. So I think that's all I will say, except I will really, really miss him. His presence, there will be a hole in the council chamber for sure. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
That's true, and thank you, Councillor. We move on to Councillor Albury. Matt?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The tributes we've heard this evening have been wonderful and completely fitting for Colin, who was a wonderful man. I only had the pleasure of knowing Colin for 4 years, but it really was a pleasure and a privilege. He was exceptionally welcoming to me as a new councillor. It's very clear that he was simply an exceptionally good person. On several occasions, I went to him to ask for advice, and he was always reassuring. Once when I was going through a particularly difficult time, he advised me to just keep smiling. It was actually really good advice, and I'm not surprised to hear everyone else attest to how supportive he was to them. As a new councillor, it was so obvious to me that Colin was Labour through and through. He was this borough through and through, and he absolutely loved standing up for it and for the people he represented. One of the silver linings of lockdown is that some of these examples of Colin standing up for local residents during numerous committees and other council meetings have been recorded, and they're there on YouTube forever, much like I think we'll always feel he's forever going to be with us. I really will miss him and consider myself very lucky to have known him, even for just a short period of time compared to so many in this council. So thank you, Colin, for being Colin, truly one of a kind, truly special. We will never forget you.
Thank you, Matt. And Councillor Harvey? Rebecca?
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to say my condolences to Colin's friends and family. I feel cheated because I didn't really know Colin that long. I've only known him 4 years, and I just hearing everyone's stories, it makes me feel so cheated. I didn't expect him not to be around anymore. So I expected him to be at the next planning meeting, and I just find it so hard to believe that he's actually not going to be there. And I think with death, it's always hard when you don't get that opportunity to say goodbye, and you lose someone in the way that we've lost Colin. It has been a privilege to know him in a short time that I have known him. He's been really supportive. He was easy to talk to, charming, and he was actually someone that I felt I could look up to, and just reassuring. And I'd say that during planning committee, I recently had to chair it for the first time, and just knowing he was there, his presence felt so reassuring to me. As everyone's heard, you know, we do like to go to the pub after committees, and for the first time in about a year and a half, I actually got to socialise, and I feel really privileged that I got to spend that time with Colin and also with Councillor Harcourt in the pub. And I would just say at that last planning committee meeting, there was a moment where Councillor Carmel and Colin were debating something that was happening. And I found myself shouting out, order, order, not something that I would normally do. I wonder where it came from. And I imagine it was from listening to Colin say it over and over several times. So that was quite amusing. And then in the pub, I think Councillor Harcourt and Colin enjoyed teasing me, I believe, around lamb chops and crispy bacon, because I did tell them that I don't eat meat, and then we had a very long conversation about lamb chops and crispy bacon. But it was so nice to have that evening for the first time being around people, because I've been quite isolated. So it was so nice to be with him. He was such a happy, wonderful, loving man. And even on that evening in the pub, he was as well. I have so much respect for him, and I'm so sad that he won't be here anymore. But I think his legacy lives on in everyone and through everything that he's done. Yeah.
Thank you, Bex. Very moving. Thank you very, very much. If we go on to Councillor Caleb-Landy, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to offer my condolences to Colin's friends and families as well. And I have to say, after so many great stories about Colin, it's very hard to know what to add, but I will try and add a few things, which I think firstly is just to say that, to a new councillor, I was elected in 2018. Colin was a great example and a great inspiration to all of us. He really acted not only as a mentor, but as an exemplar, as someone who you wanted to follow and be like. I was lucky enough to serve as deputy whip shortly after being elected, and I was also getting married around that summer. And I did speak to Colin just after being appointed and said, Colin, I'm getting married. Is there anything I could read on my honeymoon? A rough guide, a quick document to get my head into it. Colin quickly replied, as you always did, and sent me the council constitution, all 398 pages of it, as suggested, 318 pages of it as suggested reading material. I have to admit, I did not read it on my honeymoon, though I did read it. But in those 318 pages, there were a lot of words, but nothing that that was more than Colin could teach you within sort of 10-15 minutes of watching him act. He had the knowledge and experience as a whip that simply reading couldn't teach you. He knew every rule. He was on top of the detail, played by the books, and knew how to get his way and knew how to work things so that we as a Labour group were best positioned for everything. And he was a real inspiration to someone looking up to as what a whip could be, far from the sort of devilish man of mystery, and more a quiet, motivated, detail orientated ambassador for what the best of the role can be. I was also lucky enough to have Colin assigned as my mentor. And I remember my first day of being a councillor, finding it very daunting, as I suspect we all do as new councillors. Councils are like secondary school, without the teachers. It's a very large organisation to navigate, and you really want to be there to serve and to help the residents that you've been elected for, to help answer their questions and to really resolve the important matters that you're suddenly being trusted on. Colin was, I think, to so many of us, and to me in particular, just such an important source of knowledge. There was no question too easy or tricky problem that he couldn't overcome. And I looked at my text messages, before speaking today, and all of the times where I'd handle a tricky planning issue, I'd need a call with Colin to understand how best to help this resident. And within sort of an hour hour and a half, he was always there, apart from one text message in August. And I think after Councillor Jones, I now know that that was probably because Colin was on holiday. Yeah, so yeah, I guess, yeah, just to kind of conclude, I think, you know, Colin was just such an inspiration to me, and I think to so many of us young councillors or new councillors from the 2018 intake, and I'm sure many more. Yeah, I'll miss the way he laughs. You know, I'll miss just listening to him in meetings and him saying things that I knew were right, but had struggled to even realise or to think of. He was a model councillor in so many ways, and one that I will always look up to. And I just wanted to say thank you at the end to him for making me a better councillor. I've learned a lot from him, as I'm sure a lot of us have, and want to thank him for allowing us to do that.
Thank you very much. And I think when I speak for all of the councillors here when I say how absolutely appalled we are that you didn't read the Constitution whilst you're on honeymoon. You should hang your head in shame. You've let Colin down. Absolutely dreadful. Absolutely dreadful. Okay, Councillor Coleman. Go on, Ben.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm aware that I come when everything's really been said, but I just wanted to mention a couple of things. Well, it was very reassuring. Colin, as you realise, was a person of he contained everything. He was human. He contained multitudes. He was a very traditionalist when it came to London Pride, which has been pointed out many times. But he was still prepared to try new things, and he was also very generous in his attitude towards it. I thought until Bora told us about Colin and new technology and how she'd really introduced him to. I thought I was someone who played a role there, and I think it just shows a sign of his generosity and making us all think that we had a part to play. But I have to say, from watching him as somebody who often felt treated his computer keyboard as if it was an old-fashioned typewriter, he eventually, it was a delight to see how he mastered the mobile phone, he mastered social media, and it was a great joy to our whole councillors WhatsApp group when Steve introduced Colin to it this January. I remember that. I also remember how he didn't always quite get the relaxed style. In June this year, everyone piled in as always and wished him happy birthday, to which he responded, "Many thanks to everyone for their birthday greetings, which are much appreciated." Not the usual WhatsApp style, but in its turn, much appreciated. A lot of people have mentioned Colin's pride in coming from the father of the NHS is Aneurin Bevan's hometown. And Bevan, of course, said, "No society can legitimately call itself civilized if a sick person is denied medical aid because of a lack of means." And that reminds me, makes me think of the final conversation I had with Colin a couple of weeks ago when I called Steve about something, and he was at Colin's flat and he put me on speaker. And Colin described something of delight, which Steve has recounted also in his tribute on the council's website. And he described with delight how he'd been asked lots of questions at the hospital, but there was one thing they didn't ask me to do: to pay. And that was brilliant. You've got the humour, and you've got the politics, and you've got the unyielding sense of the values all together. And he was at times fairly unyielding, but he was also very loving. As and I think his nieces and his nephew know that particularly. And I remember asking him to recommend a musical to take them to when they next came to London. I think he might have asked me because occasionally I was probably the only one in the room who knew the songs, the older songs that he liked to sing. And they went to The Lion King. And when he told me how much they'd enjoyed it, his eyes gleamed and he looked chuffed and he looked a bit proud. And he was always like that when he talked about his niece and his nephew, which was always very lovely to see. So, Mr. Mayor, I think really to be honest, it's too soon to accept that he's gone. It's ridiculous how suddenly this has happened. And I think, like, well, I've been moved, I've been entertained by what people have said today. But I think, to be honest, for me, and I guess for a lot of us here, today's just really been the start of thinking about Colin and all that he meant to me. But I'm very glad I knew him, and he was an extraordinary man. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. And I now move on to Councillor Perez. Natalia? And I think Natalia is going to be our last speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much all, and for the lovely tributes as well that I've had the privilege to listen to, and the examples that you've given of interesting moments with Colin. It's been a very moving night. I want to start by giving my deepest condolences to Melanie and to Colin's family, to his nephews, to his nieces, and to the people watching on YouTube and the people that will be watching later. One of the biggest challenges, talking from a personal experience, as a migrant, is that you leave family behind. So I came from Colombia, and my family is in Colombia, it's in another continent. So you don't have those strong connections in terms of your mother or your father or your uncle or your grandparents. And as a migrant, I've chosen to build and nurturing friendships, friends that become my family in London, my family in the UK. And Colin was definitely a member of my family. He was a fantastic human being, which I looked for advice, for support. He was the grandfather, he was the uncle, he was a fantastic reference to approach in any difficult situation. I celebrate his life as a mentor, as a counselor, as a friend. I have a lovely memory of when I met him back in 2010, and when I joined the Labour Party. I spoke to him on a Saturday, and he said to me, "Why don't you join us tomorrow for a canvassing session?" It was really, I was very excited, but I was very nervous as well. It was my first experience, and I didn't know how it worked. I didn't know anything about the procedure, and I've got a lovely memory of a Sunday morning at the Lyric Square, trying to find out who Colin was. And I just saw this man standing in a corner with a huge, big smile, smoking a cigarette. And I could tell that this was Colin. His body language and his approach was very, very welcoming and very hospitable, which I found very reassuring in terms of that experience. Going out canvassing with him and learning about the canvassing process and how meticulous he was in terms of managing the canvassing board. I always admired his military style and his attention to detail and how he kept us going and how he kept us moving and motivated and going up the stairs and down the stairs and come on. It was a fantastic experience. I also remember fondly when I got elected in 2014, and he was a mentor, and he actually gave me a walk of the town hall. He was showing me the town hall, and during that process he said, "Do you mind coming with me for a cigarette?" And I said, "Yes, let's go." And I had the wonderful privilege of going to one of the balconies or of the old town hall. And it was lovely. We had a quiet moment there contemplating the river, and that was quite magical, because we were appreciative of the lovely environment in which we were at, and wonderful, at a wonderful borough. We had the river in front of us, and we could see how wonderful our area was. And he said, if I remember correctly, he alluded to an experience where he was part of a fundraising event many years ago as a councillor, and he recalled climbing down a wall. Maybe some colleagues can correct me later, but apparently for fundraising purposes, he climbed down a wall. And I'm not sure if it was a town hall's wall, but I thought that was quite inspirational. And he said, actually, there's a picture of it in a newspaper. And I always said to myself, wouldn't it be wonderful to find that picture and celebrate his passion and his commitment and his enthusiasm for the community that he served, for the community that he represented. He was a fantastic councillor. He was a fantastic activist. For me, he epitomized the Labour Party's values, always working to give ordinary people a voice, always championing social justice, always championing equality, and his integrity, his decency, his loyalty, his discipline. It was admirable from many angles, and I think we should all aspire to be the councillor that Colin was. He's a wonderful human being, and I just want to say to his family that congratulations on the wonderful Colin. He was an amazing man, and he has left fantastic legacy, not only for you, had the privilege to be as part of his family, but also, as you can hear from tonight's speeches, the fantastic legacy that he left for the community that he served, for Hammersmith and Fulham, for us, for residents, and not only for our generation, but I'm sure for future generations. So I celebrate Colin and the fantastic legacy and impact and change that he has left behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tyler. That was so impactful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I have forgotten to say that Sue Fenimore, Councillor Fenimore, would like to speak. Sue?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Colin was just a brilliant human being. He was a brilliant human being from top to toe, and he had a great sense of humour as well. I think that's the other thing that we must remember, and I hope his family, listening to all the words that have been said, these are really from the bottom of our heart. We loved Colin. We absolutely loved him from top to toe. He was funny. I recall a story about how he got locked on the balcony. The door behind him got locked at the designated smoking area on the balcony of the town hall, and he was telling his story with great humour. I also recall a time he took his, as we know, and absolutely as Councillor Smith has said, his casework and his responsibilities as a local councillor were really the most important thing to him. He cared deeply about the people that he represented, that he was humbled to represent, and his diligence with the work that he did was taken right down to, and I was reminded of this story just the other day, of the Christmas lunch order. And he would absolutely diligently sit through and work out how many prawn cocktails we'd ordered, or how many roast turkeys there were. I mean, this was a man who took his whole life in the Labour group extremely seriously, but with great humour. I love Colin very much. He was an exceptional human being, and I will greatly miss him, and my huge condolences to his family. But I think he will also be missed within council officers as well. So many council officers have been really affected by Colin's death, because they also loved and cared for him and respected him hugely. So thank you, Colin. Thank you for just being you, and we will deeply miss you, but we will never ever forget you.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you. And if I could just read out a text that Steve has just received from a man called David Evans, and it says, "I was so sad to hear of the death of Colin. Reading the tributes here is genuinely moving, and they all ring true to me. I met Colin about 30 years ago when I was a London Labour Party official, and Colin was a councillor doing what he did until he died, standing up for people who struggle to stand up for themselves, and vigorously campaigning for a fairer, better locality, Hammersmith and Fulham and the world. If I'm completely honest, we didn't always agree, but I never felt that disagreements were personal. Colin dedicated his life to try and make change for the better. That is difficult, and by definition, contested. As his military background might attest, I always knew what side Colin was on, and I'm proud to have been in the same trench as him. More recently, I was delighted to renew our relationship from the 1990s. To see him as the chief whip of the Labour group was reassuring. I always felt his experience and wisdom was fundamental to the administration being able to navigate the difficult and ever necessary course to make people's lives better. I'd like to say thank you, Colin, both for the personal inspiration you gave me and on behalf of the Labour Party, for giving so much to our party, our movement, and for your community. Know one thing for certain: you made a difference, a big one. Signed, David Evans, General Secretary, Labour Party. And to get that tribute, how wonderful is that? And to his family, I think that tonight has just shown how loved and respected Colin was, not just by the Labour group, not just by the Conservatives, but the wider family. And I'm very lucky because, unlike all of my colleagues, I'm allowed out to sit with 3 of the council officers whose main job is to make sure that I behave. And tonight, hearing them laugh and seeing the occasional tear in the eye just says really how much Colin is respected. And you know, pride is a word I associate with Colin. He took pride in his service in the army, serving his country. He took pride in his service to the Labour Party, the union movement, but most importantly of all, he took pride in serving his constituents and the people of Hammersmith and Fulham. And of course, he also drank London Pride by the gallon. When Colin first went into hospital, I called him, and it sounded just like Colin of old. You know, why are you in hospital? And so he gave me chapter and verse of what happened and what was happening, and then how wonderful the NHS was. And then he told me the operations that need to be done and how wonderful NHS was, and how terrifically he's being cared for, and how wonderful NHS was, and how touched by all the calls he'd received. But most of all, how lucky he'd been because he'd been able to see Alan and Steve, and that had been a real pickup for him. And what does that demonstrate to me? That demonstrates the true Colin, not a thought for himself, but a deep appreciation of what others were doing for him. And then the little blighty gave me a shock because a couple of days later, Mary called him and she told me that he'd confessed that now is the right time to give up smoking. Colin, give up smoking? If he'd confessed he'd also decided to stop drinking, I think it was me that would have had the fatal heart attack. Mind you, he was so crafty that just maybe that was his intent. When he went back in, I called him again, but he was so struggling with breath, he couldn't speak. So I told him not to try, that I would call back, and that for some strange reason, Mary and I were inordinately fond of him. And that was the last time he spoke. I texted him afterwards and told him how much we care for him. And then when I heard he was going down for an operation, I was kind of worried. And so I thought, well, I want Colin, when he wakes up, to have just a little bit of a smile. So I sent him this text, and it says, "Watcha," which was my normal greeting. Just sending you our love again. You're an amazing bloke." And I sent that at 13:40, and 13:40 was the time when his life was being fought for so valiantly by the doctors and nurses in Hammersmith Hospital. You know, there's a phrase, isn't there, that you die with your boots on, and Colin certainly did. He died surrounded by love. There's also a kind of peculiar belief I have that you don't really die until the last person stops speaking about you. And I think that Colin's going to live on for an incredibly long time, because not only will we be talking about him, but his nieces and nephews and children just about to be born will speak of him so much. A wonderful, wonderful guy. Now, as you're aware, there's a book of condolences for Colin, and I think it'd be great comfort to his family and friends. If you haven't already entered your thoughts, I would really encourage you to do so. And I guess as a tribute to Colin, our chief exec, Kim, has asked if she could be permitted to say a few words on behalf of our staff. And I know you'll all agree that this is appropriate. Kim?
It's tough to follow you, Mayor Murphy. It's been a very, very difficult night for us, listening to all of the tributes from everyone. But thank you for allowing me to address full council this evening. I'm moved to speak on behalf of the employees of Hammersmith and Fulham Council, because in these exceptional times of tackling the COVID-19 pandemic, it is fitting that I speak up in tribute of this very exceptional Councillor, Colin Aherne. I also offer condolences to the colleagues, friends and families of the 5 staff members we've remembered tonight. And of course, I take this moment to remember Alderman Mike Cartwright. You have heard much tonight about how Councillor Colin Aherne worked tirelessly 35 years to represent the people of Shepherd's Bush and White City as a ward councillor. But I pay tribute to Councillor Aherne, as staff at the council will mourn his loss too. Because Councillor Aherne accrued a reputation amongst staff as he was exceptionally knowledgeable about committees and constitutional rules, procedures and standing orders, not just because he had a meticulous eye for detail and accuracy, but because he relished getting things right, doing things properly and doing things well. And we've learned so much from his experience and wisdom on the transparency of decision making and the importance of robust and consistent practice. We knew him simply as Colin, because there's only been one Colin at the council. He was friendly to staff, he showed interest, and he had a great sense of humour. I personally knew him as a storyteller who would reel you in until he hit the punchline or got his message across, and then he laughed loudly. What a laugh, a smoker's laugh. My fondest memories of Colin are laughing at his stories with Tasha in the office. Funny how I text get well soon when he was in hospital last week, but he asked for jokes. He said it was the best medicine, and we were texting up until the day before he passed away. I learned much from Colin as his experience, his stories about his worldwide travels, and his love of all things Welsh shone through. Councillor Colin Aherne will remain in our thoughts as an exceptional example of a selfless public servant who was determined to improve the lives and opportunities of Hammersmith and Fulham residents. I will miss him hugely, as will council staff, particularly those in the leader's office, the governance and committee coordination teams and the election team. But on behalf of LBHF staff, past and present, I offer sincere condolences to all of Colin's councillor colleagues, to his friends and to his family. Rest in peace and rise in glory, Councillor Colin Aherne. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you very much indeed. We're now going to have 2 minutes silence for Colin, just with our thoughts and our memories of him. thank you very much. And I think that last picture of Colin was a delight. And I never knew he actually had any hair. So that was a lovely thing to see. Well, that's the end of tonight's meeting. And I'm pretty positive somehow that when we get back into the town hall for our first council meeting, afterwards we'll take the opportunity to cross the road, to go to the Sally and to raise a glass or two or three or four to that great man, Colin Aherne. Thank you to everyone that's contributed tonight, and especially thank you to his family for allowing us to have Colin for 35 years. And I hope that tonight has just given you a slight introduction to just how important and wonderful Colin Aherne was. Good night, everyone.